It began in the haze of summer, when the wheat fields of western Russia shimmered under a brutal sun, and the fate of nations moved toward their most desperate hour. The year was 1941, and Hitler's armies were unstoppable. City after city had fallen. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured or killed. The Wehrmacht's war machine, honed by conquest across Europe, was racing eastward in Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Its goal was nothing less than the destruction of the Soviet Union and the conquest of Moscow, the heart of Stalin's empire. But between the Germans and their ultimate prize stood one key obstacle: a city ancient and proud, a fortress at the crossroads of history, Smolensk. The Battle of Smolensk would become one of the most critical, brutal, and overlooked battles of the war. A massive encirclement that consumed armies, delayed the German advance, and quietly altered the course of the campaign. It was the gateway to Moscow, and its defense was the moment when the tide of destiny began to shift, even if no one yet realized it. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union was unprepared for the scale and speed of the German assault. Over 3 million German troops, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery, surged across the frontier in a lightning storm of destruction. To the north, Army Group North pushed toward Leningrad. To the south, Army Group South drove into Ukraine. At the center, Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, spearheaded by the panzer groups of Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, advanced directly toward Moscow. Their progress was breathtaking. Minsk had already fallen, and entire Soviet fronts were collapsing. The Red Army, reeling from the shock, fought to regroup amid chaos. And standing next in the path of destruction was the ancient city of Smolensk, a fortress city that had been the gateway to Moscow for centuries, where invaders from Napoleon to the Tatars had once clashed against the defenses of the Russian heartland. For Hitler and his generals, Smolensk was more than a name on a map. It was the hinge point of their entire campaign, a critical logistical and strategic hub, where railways, rivers, and highways converged. Capturing it would open the road to Moscow, the final objective of Barbarossa. For Stalin, it was a test of survival. The Red Army could not afford to lose it. As the Germans approached in early July, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, hastily formed the Western Front under General Semyon Timoshenko, with remnants of shattered armies and fresh conscripts barely trained for battle. Their task was monumental: stop Guderian's panzers, delay the German advance, and hold the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the east. The battle began on July 10, 1941, when German armored spearheads smashed into the Soviet defenses west of Smolensk. The fighting was ferocious from the first moment. Columns of German tanks rolled across the plains, cutting through infantry formations and sowing panic. Luftwaffe bombers roared overhead, turning roads into firestorms. The Soviets counterattacked again and again, often without coordination or air support, throwing themselves at the advancing tide. Whole divisions were swallowed by the pace of the German assault. By mid-July, Guderian's and Hoth's panzer groups had converged east of Smolensk, closing a massive encirclement around 3 Soviet armies, the 16th, 19th, and 20th, nearly 300,000 men trapped inside the pocket. The city itself became a cauldron of fire. Inside the encirclement, chaos reigned. Soviet troops fought from street to street, forest to forest, refusing to surrender even as ammunition and supplies ran out. The city's defenders turned every house, factory, and bridge into a fortress. The air was thick with smoke and ash. The ground trembled from constant shelling, Stalin, furious and desperate, ordered counterattacks from every direction. Reinforcements from the 21st and 13th Armies attempted to break through the German lines, and for days the battlefield was a storm of confusion. Tanks and infantry clashing amid villages reduced to rubble. The Soviet soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity that shocked the Germans. They were no longer retreating in chaos. They were learning to fight, adapting, enduring. By late July, the Smolensk pocket began to collapse. Thousands of Soviet troops were captured, tens of thousands killed, yet the encirclement did not end as neatly as German planners had imagined. Significant numbers of Soviet soldiers managed to break out in small groups, escaping eastward to form new defensive lines. The city of Smolensk itself was reduced to ruins, its once beautiful churches and stone walls shattered by bombardment. When the battle finally ended in early September, the Germans had taken their prize, but at a cost. But the delay had been catastrophic. The fighting around Smolensk had lasted over 2 months, far longer than the Wehrmacht's timetable allowed. The road to Moscow, which was supposed to be open by early August, remained clogged with wreckage and exhaustion. It was at Smolensk that the seeds of Germany's failure were planted. The battle revealed that the Soviet Union, though wounded and bleeding, would not collapse as easily as Hitler had believed. Every mile of advance cost more than the last. The Red Army was learning to adapt, to fight with coordination, and to absorb unimaginable losses without breaking. The delay at Smolensk gave the Soviets precious time to rebuild, time that would later be measured in snow and blood before the gates of Moscow. German generals like Guderian warned that every week lost was a week closer to disaster. But Hitler, blinded by ambition, pressed on. The Wehrmacht would reach the outskirts of Moscow only in December, too late, too cold, too exhausted, and the shadow of Smolensk would follow them all the way. For the soldiers who fought there, Smolensk was a crucible. For the Germans, it was the first taste of the grinding war of attrition that would consume the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, it was a baptism by fire, proof that even defeat could buy time, and that resistance, however costly, could still matter. The fields around the city became graveyards for men and machines alike. The rivers ran red. The forests whispered with the ghosts of the fallen. Smolensk had always been the gateway to Moscow, but in 1941 it became the gate that refused to fully open. Today, the ruins are gone, rebuilt into a quiet city of memorials and silent hills. But beneath its streets lie the bones of those who fought in one of history's most overlooked yet pivotal battles, the clash that decided not who would win the war, but how long humanity would endure its horror. The Battle of Smolensk was the beginning of the long, bloody lesson that the road to Moscow was not a path of conquest, but of destruction. Tonight we return to those burning fields, to the roar of engines, the cries of the encircled, and the moment when the war's momentum began, quietly and tragically, to change. This is the entire history of the Battle of Smolensk, the forgotten gateway to Moscow, the triumph that became a warning, and the battle where victory came at the cost of time itself. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The story begins not with battle, but with rivers flowing quietly through wide valleys, their waters glinting under soft skies. Smolensk stands where the Dnieper bends, a city shaped by currents that connect distant lands. Traders once drifted along these waters with furs, honey, and salt, leaving behind echoes of voices long vanished. Churches with white walls rose on the hills, their domes shining faintly as if reflecting both heaven and earth. Wooden bridges carried merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims, each leaving a trace upon the soil. The land itself seemed patient, absorbing footsteps, hooves and wheels, never hurrying, never forgetting. Forests whispered at the edge of fields, watching centuries pass with the slow rhythm of seasons. Smolensk became less a settlement than a threshold, a place where roads converged and paths divided. It was a crossroads not only of armies but of destinies, and so the rivers flowed on, drawing us toward what lies ahead. To speak of Smolensk is to speak of a gateway, and gateways are never silent for long. For 1,000 years it has been the hinge between East and West, open to travelers yet vulnerable to conquest. Vikings and Varangians once rode past, their oars dipping into the current with steady rhythm. Polish knights rode across the meadows, leaving banners behind them that soon faded in the rain. Lithuanians came with their own ambitions, their shadows stretching long across the fields. Moscow, rising further east, always looked toward Smolensk with wary eyes, for whoever held this city held the corridor to the Russian heartland. Walls of stone and timber rose higher, each generation repairing what the last had lost. Yet no wall could stop the slow turning of history's wheel, and as the wheel turned, the city waited for its next trial. The Dnieper was not only a barrier but a bond, carrying whispers of distant lands, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The river linked villages and kingdoms like beads on a string. Monks once sailed its waters, reading psalms under their breath as gulls circled above. Caravans rested by its banks, their fires casting warm light on cold nights. Farmers came to the water's edge, washing tools after long days in the fields. In quiet evenings the river mirrored the stars, carrying their trembling light downstream. For Smolensk, this was more than geography. It was lifeblood, trade, and promise. The river gave protection, yet it also invited strangers from afar. With every boat and every crossing, the city absorbed another layer of memory, and still the waters kept flowing, untroubled by the burdens of men. Smolensk's strength lay not only in its rivers, but in its hills, rising gently above the valleys. Upon these ridges, fortresses were built, their stones quarried from nearby earth. Travelers would see towers against the horizon, a reminder that the city was guarded yet exposed. Markets stretched below the walls, filled with voices in many tongues. Fishermen mended nets, while women sold bread baked in clay ovens. Children chased each other between carts, their laughter carrying across the square. Life here was simple yet never untouched by rumor of armies beyond the forests. For the land was open, and the city's stones seemed to know that peace was never permanent. Smolensk breathed in rhythm with the borderlands, never fully secure, never fully still, and in that rhythm it learned endurance. The chronicles of Russia speak of Smolensk, often, sometimes with pride, sometimes with sorrow. Princes fought for it, claiming it as inheritance, prize, or shield. When enemies pressed from the west, Smolensk was the anvil against which Moscow's strength was forged. When power shifted eastward, the city became a frontier, both vulnerable and essential. Churches burned and were rebuilt, their bells cast anew after every calamity. Old songs tell of warriors standing on its walls, their eyes fixed on distant horizons. To hold Smolensk was to promise safety for Moscow, yet to lose it was to invite peril. The city was not merely ground to be seized, but a symbol of who would control the Russian heart, and in this symbolism it became heavier than stone, heavier than the towers that crowned its hills. Still, the wind passed over it, as if carrying away each century's sorrow. For the people who lived here, history was not an abstract tale, but daily life. Farmers tilled fields fertilized by battles long past, their soil dark with memory. Traders crossed bridges that had been burned and rebuilt countless times. Women carried water from wells dug where armies once camped. Children played among ruins whose stories they only half understood. To them, Smolensk was both home and burden, beautiful yet haunted. The weight of history pressed upon daily chores like an unseen companion. Yet life endured, quietly persistent, like grass pushing through cracked stones. The people adapted, for they had no choice but to live with the past as neighbor, and in that endurance, they prepared unknowingly for the storms to come. Centuries gave the city a quiet dignity, as though age itself had draped a cloak upon its shoulders. Its cathedrals, though scarred, still rang bells that carried over the fields. The Kremlin walls of Smolensk, vast and solemn, enclosed more than buildings. They enclosed memory. Pilgrims paused here, sensing a weight they could not name, a heaviness in the very air. Smolensk seemed always to stand at the edge of some great unfolding. Those who walked its streets felt both safe and vulnerable, as though shadow and light lived side by side. Even in peace, the city whispered of storms, as though remembering too much to forget. Every stone, every arch, every tower was a witness, silent but unyielding. It was a city that looked outward and inward at once, watching the horizon while guarding its heart. And so it waited, patient as the river that ran beside it. History often forgets the quiet spaces between the larger battles. Yet Smolensk lived in those spaces. It endured when others marched past, waiting to be remembered when the storms returned. It was a place shaped by endurance, carved by rivers, and crowned by time. Its story was not of a single moment, but of centuries accumulating like sediment. One could walk its streets and feel the weight of countless footsteps layered upon one another. Each wall carried whispers, each field held shadows, each river bend remembered a crossing. The city had seen armies come and armies go, and yet it remained. That persistence was its true character, a strength deeper than fortresses. Smolensk was not a stage, but a living memory, still breathing in the pauses of history, and in its breath, the story of war was about to begin again. In the summer of 1812, the rivers of Smolensk reflected a new shadow, one that drifted from the west with endless columns of men. Napoleon's Grande Armée, vast beyond imagining, advanced like a tide upon the land. Horses kicked up clouds of dust, their hooves muffling the earth's own quiet heartbeat. Villagers watched from doorways as banners of blue, white, and red rippled against the horizon. The air seemed heavy, as though the forests themselves held their breath. To the people of Smolensk, the memory of past invasions returned like an old wound aching in bad weather. They knew that armies had crossed before, but never in such number, never with such certainty of purpose. The Dnieper flowed beside them, as if unaware, its waters indifferent to the march of history. Smolensk, once again, found itself at the center of a path no one could escape, and thus the ghosts of older wars stirred, whispering that another trial had come. The French soldiers spoke languages unfamiliar to local ears, their songs and shouts carrying over fields that had known quieter melodies. They marched with confidence, their uniforms bright in the summer sun, their muskets polished as though still untested. For a moment it seemed as if their strength was too great to resist. Yet Smolensk was not a city to be taken lightly, for its stones had endured centuries of trials. The walls, though aged, still held pride, and the people within them still held memory. Russian defenders stood ready, their resolve steady even as their numbers were thin. Families packed hurried belongings, uncertain whether to flee or remain. Bells rang from towers, summoning prayers for protection and endurance. The city was once again poised at the edge of survival, listening to the echo of approaching drums, and in those echoes, history prepared to carve new scars. The clash that followed was not merely of men, but of endurance against fire. Flames rose as buildings were struck, roofs collapsing into embers that lit the night sky. The smell of smoke lingered for days, drifting along streets once filled with laughter and trade. Civilians moved quietly through alleys, their voices hushed, as if not to disturb the destruction itself. Soldiers held the walls with defiance, knowing that each moment of resistance was a seed of delay. The river reflected the glow of burning houses, turning its waters into ribbons of trembling light. Yet even in this moment of violence, Smolensk revealed its resilience, refusing to surrender easily. The French pressed hard, believing victory inevitable, yet the city absorbed their force like stone meeting rain. To Napoleon, it was a step toward Moscow. To Russia, it was a wound endured for survival. And so Smolensk burned but did not vanish. For those who survived, the memory of that summer was etched deeper than stone. Villagers spoke of days when the air itself seemed heavy with ash. Children remembered the strange language of soldiers and the uneasy silence that followed their songs. Families recalled the bells that rang until the towers themselves crumbled. The streets bore scars, yet life crept back slowly, as it always did. Farmers returned to fields that had been trampled, coaxing grain from soil darkened by battle. Priests restored altars, their prayers mingling with the silence of ruins. Smolensk, though battered, gathered its strength like a body recovering after fever. The city stood once more, changed but unbroken, its spirit shaped by fire. And in that survival, it whispered of future endurance still to come. For Russia, the burning of Smolensk became a symbol larger than the city itself. It was the first great stand against the invader, a moment when sacrifice slowed the enemy's march. The defense cost much, yet it gave time for Moscow to prepare, time for Russia to gather its strength. Napoleon's soldiers marched past ruins, unaware that delay would weigh heavily upon them in months ahead. To the Russian mind, Smolensk became not just a place but an idea, a reminder that fire can be endured if it buys survival. The people rebuilt, brick by brick, carrying memory into every new wall. Songs and stories told of endurance, passing from one generation to the next. The ashes of 1812 remained beneath cobblestones, unseen but never forgotten. Smolensk became a city of scars, and scars became its strength. And in that strength, it waited for the next storm history would bring. Travelers in later years still spoke of the silence that lingered in Smolensk. They said that on quiet nights, one could almost hear distant drums rolling through the air. Farmers claimed the soil turned up fragments, buttons, buckles, rusted iron that whispered of a battle past. Pilgrims lit candles in rebuilt churches, their prayers carrying a sense of gratitude and sorrow intertwined. Children grew up walking streets where entire neighborhoods had once burned. Yet in their laughter there was also defiance, proof that life returns even where memory is heavy. The ghosts of 1812 did not frighten so much as remind, gently urging the living not to forget. They became companions of the city, invisible but enduring, shaping its character with unseen hands. In every rebuilt wall, one could sense both loss and resilience. And through that resilience, Smolensk endured with quiet dignity. In Russia's wider story, the burning of Smolensk marked the beginning of Napoleon's long unraveling. The city's resistance slowed the French enough to make retreat inevitable later in the winter. Moscow might have fallen, but Smolensk had written the first chapter of resistance. The Grande Armée marched on, yet left behind embers that would smolder in memory forever. To the people of Smolensk, survival was its own victory, even if ruin surrounded them. They knew that endurance, not brilliance, had saved Russia's heart. Smolensk's role was often overshadowed by Moscow and Borodino, yet without it the story would not be the same. The gateway had demanded its price, and in paying it the nation bought time. The scars of 1812 gave meaning to future battles, teaching lessons in patience and sacrifice, and those lessons would echo when another invasion came from the west. 2 centuries later, the echoes of that campaign still linger in Smolensk, like shadows at the edge of twilight. Stones hold memory longer than men, and the stones of Smolensk carry centuries of it. Travelers who walk the city can still sense a quiet weight in the air. The Dnieper flows past, as it always has, yet beneath its calm surface lie reflections of flame. Churches stand again, bells ring again, yet the memory of 1812 drifts like smoke that never fully clears. Smolensk remains both scarred and sacred, a reminder of endurance against overwhelming force. The ghosts are not mournful, but steady, keeping watch over streets rebuilt many times. Their presence binds past and present, whispering that strength is not in avoiding storms, but in surviving them. Smolensk continues to endure, its stones bearing witness without complaint. And so the story moves onward, from old embers to new trials waiting beyond the horizon. The summer of 1941 opened with long days. The fields of Belarus warm and filled with the scents of grass and grain. Farmers tended crops unaware that armies were already on the move, their paths converging like rivers racing toward a single basin. The Wehrmacht advanced with a speed that stunned the world, their columns stretching across endless roads. Tanks growled softly in the distance, their tracks pressing deep into the soil. Horses pulling supply carts trotted beside motorized convoys, old and new together in a relentless flow. Villages fell silent as families fled, carrying what little they could hold in their arms. The air seemed thick with dust and rumor, each morning heavier than the last. Stalin, far away in Moscow, hesitated to speak, unable to accept what was unfolding so quickly. The Red Army stumbled, regrouping only to be swept aside again, and still the summer sun shone, indifferent to the gathering storm. For those in the countryside, the invasion was first heard before it was seen. Distant rumbling like thunder became the constant companion of the land. The earth trembled softly as divisions pressed forward, road after road filling with soldiers. Fields once rich with grain now bore the weight of endless boots. Birds scattered from hedgerows, startled into restless flight. Old men remembered earlier wars, muttering that such speed had never been seen before. The Wehrmacht moved as though nothing could stand in its path, each day swallowing miles with startling ease. The Soviet frontier defenses, unprepared, crumbled in the face of this sudden tide. Whole units were lost in the confusion, their absence marked only by empty roads and scattered belongings, and as the noise drew nearer, the horizon itself seemed to darken. Stalin remained in silence during those first days, his voice absent as cities fell one after another. In Moscow, whispers spread of disbelief, as if denial could hold back the truth. Orders came late or not at all, and confusion spread through the chain of command. Trains tried to carry men and supplies to the front, but railways clogged with refugees moving in the opposite direction. Maps on officers' tables changed daily, red lines vanishing into uncertainty. Young conscripts marched forward with courage but little guidance, their determination unmatched by their equipment. Tanks were scattered, planes destroyed on the ground, and communication lines cut as quickly as they were laid. The Soviet Union stood vast, yet fragile in those first weeks of war. In the heart of this silence and uncertainty, the people of Smolensk waited, sensing their city's name would soon be spoken again. And so the storm rolled eastward, louder with each passing day. Belarus became the first great stage of destruction, its villages and forests absorbed into the path of the invasion. Minsk fell within days, leaving a gap through which German divisions surged eastward. Roads clogged with retreating soldiers, civilians, and wagons carrying hurried belongings. Fields that had once promised harvests were left abandoned, stalks trampled and cut down. In forests, groups of Soviet soldiers tried to reorganize, their voices low and urgent in the shade of trees. Yet the German advance pressed onward with relentless rhythm, pushing the front line deeper into Soviet territory. Each step forward seemed effortless, though the effort was immense, supplied by countless hands and endless convoys. Dust hung heavy in the air, settling into the pores of skin and stone alike. The land groaned under the weight of movement, as if protesting the pace imposed upon it. And behind each day's advance, silence followed, broken only by echoes of retreat. The Red Army did not collapse without resistance, but its resistance was scattered and desperate. Units fought where they could, buying time in small bursts of courage. Officers ordered counterattacks, but often against overwhelming odds and with little preparation. Soldiers dug shallow trenches in the soil, clinging to ground that shifted beneath their feet. Communication faltered, orders were lost, and entire formations vanished into confusion. Yet even in disarray, the spirit of endurance did not break, for men fought with the land itself as ally. Rivers slowed the German advance, forests swallowed men whole, and swamps resisted the weight of machines. These natural barriers gave shape to scattered resistance, delaying what seemed unstoppable. For each mile gained, time was lost, and in time lay the seeds of survival. And so, even in defeat, a rhythm of defiance took hold. By late June, the front lines had stretched thin, reaching toward the ancient pathways leading to Smolensk. Roads grew crowded with both victors and vanquished, their fates bound together by geography. German commanders looked eastward, their maps pointing toward Moscow as the next great prize. Soviet generals, though shaken, began to understand the weight of their task: delay, regroup, and hold if possible. Smolensk's location, so often a curse, once again became the inevitable meeting ground of armies. Civilians felt the pressure in the air, sensing that their city was next in the path of fire. Bells rang faintly from churches, their tones swallowed by the hum of distant machinery. Farmers harvested hastily, not knowing if they would live to eat what they gathered. The ground that had carried so many invasions before prepared itself for another, and still the summer sun burned, as though unaware of what approached. The speed of the invasion carried with it both strength and danger. The Wehrmacht's lines stretched longer with each passing day. Supply routes pulled thin across vast distances. Fuel ran low, trucks wore down, and horses strained under endless loads. Commanders urged their men forward, but even iron machines grew weary in the dust. The Soviet retreat left behind a land stripped of supplies, fields empty, and wells dry. Villagers burned what they could not carry, leaving little for the invaders to take. This scorched path slowed the advance, though it could not stop it entirely. The Red Army, scattered but not destroyed, began to gather itself further east. Small sparks of resistance flickered, promising that the tide was not yet complete, and in those sparks a fragile balance began to form. By July, the name of Smolensk returned to the lips of generals and soldiers alike. It stood as the next great barrier, the gateway through which the road to Moscow must pass. German columns turned their eyes toward it, confident yet cautious after weeks of strain. Soviet commanders rallied what forces they could, determined to defend the ancient city once more. The stage was set, though few understood how heavy the cost would be. For Smolensk was not merely a city, but a threshold, a test of endurance and will. Its rivers, fields, and walls had seen centuries of trials, and now another loomed before them. Civilians braced themselves, gathering what food and belongings they could, listening to the growing thunder on the horizon. The summer of 1941 had begun in silence, but it now carried the weight of inevitability. And so the land between rivers prepared once more to endure history's storm. By mid-July, the roads leading to Smolensk grew heavy with the movement of men, animals, and machines. Dust rose into the warm air, coating fields, trees, and weary faces alike. German divisions, advancing from north and south, stretched their arms across the landscape like great pincers seeking to clasp shut. Villages became waypoints on a vast chessboard, their thatched roofs marking progress and delay. Soviet units, scattered yet determined, tried to hold ground but were pressed further east each day. Along the roads, families with carts joined retreating soldiers, their paths merging into a river of uncertainty. Horses strained under loads, wheels creaked on rutted tracks, and voices mingled into a chorus of fatigue. Still, the advance pressed on, each mile narrowing the space left to breathe. Smolensk, quiet but restless, felt the pressure draw closer with each passing hour, and in this pressure, the first outlines of encirclement began to appear. German generals saw the map unfold as an opportunity, a chance to trap entire Soviet armies west of the Dnieper. To them, the roads converging on Smolensk were not mere paths but arteries to be cut. Their confidence grew with each successful maneuver, believing the Red Army could be broken in a single vast cauldron. Yet even as plans formed, the land itself resisted, slowing convoys and testing endurance. Forests concealed Soviet counterblows, rivers demanded bridging, and sudden storms turned tracks into mud. Still the advance continued, methodical and unyielding, like hands drawing shut a heavy curtain. Refugees felt it most keenly, caught between fleeing eastward and being overtaken from behind. Carts broke down, children cried in hunger, and yet the march pressed forward without pause. Smolensk, at the center of this tightening circle, waited like prey sensing the hunter's breath, and the circle drew closer with each decision made in distant headquarters. For the Soviet soldiers, the encirclement was not clear at first, only felt in the growing weight of retreat. Orders arrived late, or not at all, and entire divisions became uncertain of their position. Officers urged their men forward, yet roads already overflowed with civilians in flight. Trucks broke down from overuse, horses collapsed from exhaustion, and men walked barefoot when boots gave way. Along river crossings, the press of humanity became almost unbearable, a tide struggling toward uncertain safety. The Dnieper, ancient and indifferent, carried the reflections of this movement across its broad waters. Soldiers promised themselves that another line would hold, another defense would form, yet each line soon dissolved. Still, within the exhaustion there was resolve, a determination not to yield entirely. Even in confusion, men turned and fought, delaying the advance with fragments of resistance. And in these fragments, the story of Smolensk's defense began to take shape. The tension grew in the forests where narrow tracks became lifelines. Convoys of trucks moved slowly beneath the trees, headlights dimmed, engines struggling against the weight of supplies. Villagers guided columns with whispered directions, while others slipped away into the woods to hide. At night the glow of distant fires lit the sky, but here among the pines, shadows swallowed the sound of footsteps. Soviet units slipped quietly through these corridors, some unaware that the encirclement was already forming around them. German patrols pressed forward with steady pace, their maps guiding them toward the narrowing gaps. In the hush of the trees, Time itself seemed compressed, every hour carrying the weight of days. Horses stamped nervously, sensing what men tried not to speak aloud. The woods, once a place of safety, became part of the closing net, and still the circle narrowed, tightening with each movement on the map. As July deepened, the pressure on Smolensk itself became inescapable. The city filled with those who had nowhere else to go. Its markets turned into gathering points for the displaced. Monasteries opened their doors to refugees, their ancient walls echoing with hushed prayers. Wells ran low as thousands pressed in from the countryside, seeking water, shelter, or simply a place to rest. The streets grew crowded with wagons, soldiers, and families, a living maze of motion and fatigue. Above it all, the towers of Smolensk stood, silent witnesses to another trial approaching. To the inhabitants, the memory of 1812 returned like a distant bell, reminding them that their city had burned before. Yet this memory did not bring only fear but also endurance, a sense that survival was possible even in fire. Each day grew heavier, but each day was lived nonetheless. And in this waiting, the city braced itself for the storm at its gates. For the Germans, the encirclement was a test of coordination as much as strength. Pincer movements required speed, precision, and communication across long distances. Generals watched the narrowing space with anticipation, eager to complete the trap. Soldiers marched with confidence, believing the end was near for their exhausted foe. Yet cracks began to show. As fuel ran low and supplies trailed behind, horses labored, engines broke down, and men marched on foot through the dust of endless roads. The promise of victory seemed clear, yet the land refused to yield entirely. Soviet units fought on, slipping through gaps, refusing to dissolve completely. What was meant to be swift became prolonged, and each delay gave Moscow precious time. And in those delays, the story of Smolensk bent toward endurance rather than collapse. The Red Army, though battered, showed resilience that surprised even itself. Commanders gathered remnants of units, forming new lines from fragments of broken divisions. Soldiers, weary but unwilling to surrender, dug into earthworks and prepared to fight again. The encirclement, though nearly closed, was not yet complete, and through narrow corridors men slipped eastward. Families clung to soldiers, pleading for guidance, sharing bread and water where they could. Along riverbanks, makeshift ferries carried men and wagons across under cover of night. Fires burned on distant hills, their glow marking both destruction and resistance. Each sunrise brought new uncertainty, but also new determination to continue. Smolensk, though threatened, became the anchor of this fragile stand. And so the city entered the heart of its trial, with the gates nearly closed. By late July, the circle was all but sealed, the pincers nearly touching across the fields. To the west, German units celebrated the nearing of victory. To the east, Soviet soldiers struggled to keep open narrow paths of escape. The roads remained clogged with wagons, refugees, and broken equipment, a river of humanity pressing forward. Each mile became harder than the last, each step carrying the weight of desperation. Yet in that desperation lay a kind of quiet strength, a refusal to vanish entirely into defeat. Smolensk, the ancient gateway, now stood surrounded by fire and steel, yet still alive. Its churches, its hills, its rivers bore witness to the closing of the gates. For the people, time itself seemed suspended. Each day stretched into eternity. The stage was set for the Cauldron of Smolensk, where endurance would be tested beyond imagination. And so the gates closed, but the story of survival was only beginning. The encirclement of Smolensk created a silence that was heavy yet alive, a quiet pressing upon every footstep and heartbeat. Soviet soldiers found themselves surrounded, the roads back blocked by advancing columns of the enemy. Dust and heat clung to uniforms and skin, mixing with the weight of uncertainty and exhaustion. Officers whispered orders that sometimes reached no one, lost amid the chaos of movement and confusion. Fields once open became traps, where men wandered seeking paths that no longer existed. Streams and forests offered brief refuge, yet could not hold them forever. Meals were sparse, shared silently among companions who had grown into family within the same struggle. Every night brought a mix of relief and fear, for darkness concealed dangers, yet also offered a small chance of escape. Even the wind seemed to carry warning, rustling leaves like voices in the trees, and as the circle tightened, the soldiers moved with a quiet, unspoken resolve to survive. For the men pressed into the pocket, time became a strange companion, measured not by hours but by distance and hunger. Water from rivers was rationed carefully, shared with comrades whose faces showed both fatigue and determination. Fires smoldered briefly to cook what little food could be found, their smoke curling upward before being extinguished to avoid notice. Horses too struggled, their flanks slick with sweat, their breath labored as they pressed forward. Letters from home, folded carefully and tucked in pockets, reminded them of a world outside that seemed impossibly distant. Each day brought small acts of courage, guiding wounded men, sharing bread, finding shelter beneath broken trees. Soldiers walked for hours over rough ground, listening for the softest signs of the enemy or the faintest path of escape. In the quiet they whispered names, prayers, and memories, clinging to fragments of normalcy. And through all of this, the shadows lengthened, a gentle reminder that time was passing even here. The circle of the Smolensk pocket grew tighter, and with it the weight of endurance. The civilian perspective added a deeper layer to the encirclement's human cost. Families huddled together in barns or hollowed-out cellars, trying to remain invisible and yet nourished. Children clutched blankets around small shoulders, their eyes wide with incomprehension. Elders murmured advice, learned from past invasions, speaking in quiet tones to calm the trembling young. Wells and streams were shared, yet supplies dwindled under the strain of so many pressed into limited space. Smoke from distant fires reached the city, curling over roofs and fields in thin grey ribbons. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move, carrying a stillness that pressed upon every living thing. The daily tasks of survival, fetching water, gathering food, tending small injuries, became acts of quiet heroism. These acts, small yet vital, were repeated each day, creating a rhythm that bound the frightened community together. And in these rhythms there was a sense that life could persist, even under immense pressure. The city's heartbeat continued, steady and patient. Soviet command struggled under the pressure, trying to marshal forces with resources stretched thin. Communication faltered over long distances, and some messages arrived only after the moment had passed. Officers worked tirelessly to reorganize fragmented units, their maps covered with marks indicating retreat, resistance, and regrouping. Soldiers relied on one another, passing whispers from squad to squad when radio signals failed. Orders were given quietly, often improvised in response to immediate threats, rather than long-term strategy. Dust and exhaustion clung to every uniform, proof of the relentless march that had brought them here. Even in the midst of chaos, there were moments of careful planning, small victories in maneuvering troops through narrow gaps. Each step forward was a testament to endurance, even if the future remained uncertain. And through these efforts, the human spirit persisted, quiet but unbroken. The pocket was closing, yet within it resilience endured. As the encirclement tightened, the landscape itself seemed to press in. Forests became mazes, their shadows offering both cover and disorientation. Fields were pocked with abandoned wagons and equipment, remnants of units that had fallen or fled. Roads were clogged with men, horses, and carts, a slow-moving river that could not be hurried. The wind carried the scent of dust and smoke, mixing with the faint tang of ripening grain. Birds flew overhead, seemingly indifferent to the human struggle below, yet lending motion and rhythm to the otherwise still day. Even the river's surface shimmered with reflection, mirroring clouds that drifted lazily as though unconcerned by the human tides. Soldiers paused occasionally, catching their breath, washing in streams, sharing quiet words with those who had become companions in survival. Each breath drawn seemed heavier than the last, yet there was a careful persistence in every movement, and as the circle drew ever closer, the land became both a cradle and a challenge for endurance. Hunger and fatigue were constant companions in the encirclement, pressing upon men and animals alike. Meals were small, shared in hushed tones, eaten while one eye watched the roads ahead. Horses were fed last, often, as men considered the long journey still required to escape the tightening net. The evening brought a strange lull, where the sounds of distant movement mixed with sighs and whispers from those crouched in concealment. Families moved quietly past soldiers, exchanging brief nods, sharing small comforts, offering water or bread. Even exhaustion held a rhythm, each day measured in steps forward, breaths drawn, and soft words murmured. Stories of home were exchanged to remind one another that life existed beyond the shadow of the pocket. The mind wandered to memories of summer evenings, of rivers undisturbed, of quiet towns where life seemed easier. And in these wandering thoughts, soldiers and civilians alike found a fragile hope. Time moved slowly, yet it carried them closer to paths that might yet lead beyond the encirclement. The first great encirclements of Smolensk revealed the cost of war in quiet, human terms. Entire units disappeared from view, swallowed by roads, forests, and confusion. Yet in each loss, there was resilience in the fragments that remained. Soldiers, civilians, and families adapted to the relentless pressure, finding small ways to endure. Each day became a test of patience, courage, and careful judgment. Even fear became a companion, a rhythm to which every heartbeat adjusted. The city, its streets and fields filled with the echoes of movement, held its breath with those trapped within, and as the shadows lengthened, a fragile thread of survival stretched between those inside and the uncertain world beyond. In the midst of disappearance, endurance became the quiet triumph of the human spirit. And so Smolensk waited, holding its inhabitants in the soft embrace of resilience. By early August, the full weight of the encirclement pressed upon both soldiers and civilians. The roads to safety were narrow, sometimes blocked, and yet every step carried determination. Men and women found courage in routine, in small acts of sharing water, guiding companions, or simply keeping pace. Horses moved steadily, despite fatigue, wagons creaked along uneven tracks, and rivers offered both obstacles and aid. Families whispered names, prayers, and hopes as they pressed through the maze of uncertainty. The wind, soft and warm, seemed to carry the memory of past summers when the city had faced other trials. Even in darkness, there was light in small victories, finding shelter, catching food, or helping another to keep moving. The encirclement, though nearly complete, could not crush these quiet acts of endurance. And as the day turned to night, Smolensk remained a city of shadows, yet shadows that moved and breathed. Within those shadows, hope persisted, carrying the story forward to the next chapter of survival. Within the tightening embrace of the Smolensk pocket, Soviet soldiers moved with a combination of discipline and quiet desperation. The roads clogged with retreating units, became narrow channels where every step required careful judgment. Officers whispered orders that were repeated in hushed tones down lines of weary men. Soldiers carried ammunition and water, sharing what little they could spare with comrades. Trees offered cover and concealment, their leaves rustling softly in the summer wind. Horses pulled wagons with supplies that might not last another day, their breaths mingling with the dust of churned roads. Villagers and refugees moved alongside soldiers, adding weight to already crowded paths. Yet in the midst of this pressure, small acts of courage surfaced, guiding the lost, carrying the wounded, sharing food. Each step forward was a silent defiance, a refusal to disappear entirely, and in this quiet persistence, the pocket itself seemed alive, pulsing with the rhythm of survival. Breakout attempts began under the cover of night, when shadows offered the possibility of movement without detection. Soldiers slipped through gaps in the German lines, hearts pounding in tandem with cautious footsteps. The forest floor was uneven, roots and fallen branches, making progress slow and deliberate. Water from small streams refreshed the exhausted, its cool touch offering a momentary relief from the heat and dust. Maps and compasses guided those with knowledge, while others relied on instinct and memory. Horses strained beneath loads of supplies, yet the bond between man and animal endured, a quiet trust that carried them forward. Moments of silence were brief, interrupted by distant shouts or the creak of wheels. Small groups moved together, sharing whispered encouragements and silent prayers. Each night offered hope that daylight might reveal a path beyond the encirclement, and as dawn approached, the quiet resolve of men and women continued to shape their fate. Within the city, the streets became narrow corridors of movement and resistance. Soldiers and volunteers improvised barricades, using rubble, carts, and furniture to slow the advance of mechanized units. Messages passed from one squad to another, in careful whispers, a chain of coordination built under extreme pressure. The smell of earth and smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of baked bread and dust. Soldiers paused to rest where they could, their faces streaked with grime and determination. Even in moments of exhaustion, eyes remained alert, scanning for both threat and opportunity. Families watched from hidden windows, offering water, bread, or encouragement to those who passed. Each day brought small victories, a blocked road, a delayed advance, a comrade safely guided through the maze of movement. And though the outcome seemed uncertain, the effort itself became a quiet triumph of human endurance. In these narrow streets, the city itself seemed to breathe with them. Some soldiers found themselves in small pockets separated from the main groups, yet they continued to resist and survive. A single squad might hold a stretch of road, slowing armored vehicles with ingenuity rather than force. Men and women dug shallow foxholes beneath the trees, their movements careful and deliberate. Horses rested, while water was drawn from nearby streams, shared quietly with all who needed it. Messages carried from one isolated position to another, connecting fragments of defense across the landscape. Even as German units pressed forward, their advance was tempered by this scattered, quiet resistance. Soldiers whispered names, prayers, and memories, reminding one another of the lives they still carried within them. These moments of connection became as important as the fighting itself, small reminders of purpose and identity, and within the Cauldron, each day survived felt like a small victory. Even in separation, courage and resolve persisted. The physical toll of the encirclement pressed upon everyone, yet the spirit of endurance remained. Exhausted legs carried bodies forward over rough ground, across rivers, and through dense woods. Dust clung to skin and clothing, mixing with sweat and the faint scent of smoke from distant fires. Horses, wagons, and supplies strained under relentless movement, yet continued to serve as lifelines for those on foot. Soldiers shared whatever rations remained, dividing small amounts of bread or water with careful generosity. Even in the quietest moments, vigilance was maintained, ears and eyes tuned to the slightest sound. Conversations were sparse, yet murmured encouragements passed down lines of weary men. The pocket pressed inward, a living force, and every step taken against it became an act of resistance. And as the hours stretched, the rhythm of human endurance pulsed steadily through the encircled land. Each breath drawn was both struggle and quiet triumph. Occasionally, small groups found ways to slip past German lines, their escape measured in careful movement and whispered coordination. Paths through forests and fields offered temporary relief, though no journey was without risk. Streams and ditches became both obstacles and allies, carrying men and wagons in turns. Dust hung in the air, clinging to faces, hands, and clothing like a silent witness to effort. Soldiers moved with patience, understanding that speed often invited danger. Each member of a group shared responsibility for others, a quiet covenant that ensured none were abandoned lightly. The night offered cover, and the stars guided those who had knowledge of the terrain. Even in the most desperate hours, small acts of ingenuity allowed men and women to persevere. And with each narrow escape, hope flickered quietly in the heart of the cauldron. The effort was unceasing, yet humanity persisted. Within the encirclement, acts of quiet heroism were everywhere, often unnoticed but vital. Men carried water to those unable to reach streams, shared food with strangers, and offered words of comfort to the frightened. Horses, tired and burdened, were tended with care, their strength preserved for the journey still to come. Soldiers repaired broken equipment as best they could, improvising with what was at hand. Families sheltered in barns, cellars, and forests, providing warmth and sustenance to those passing by. Each day brought small victories of survival, delayed advances, and protected lives. The land itself became a witness to this quiet courage, absorbing sweat, dust, and whispers into its soil. Even as defeat loomed in the wider picture, the effort slowed the enemy, turning what seemed inevitable into a drawn, measured struggle. And through all of this, the city and countryside alike held the rhythm of quiet persistence. Each act, small or large, echoed through the cauldron. By the end of this period, the Smolensk cauldron was filled with the quiet murmur of human endurance. Soldiers continued to resist, civilians continued to hide and assist, and even the exhausted animals carried their loads forward. The roads, fields, and forests bore the marks of this struggle, etched into dust, soil, and broken tracks. Messages, whispers, and improvised signals bound the scattered defenders together, creating a fragile network of resistance. Moments of connection and compassion punctuated the harsh rhythm of movement and effort. Each small act became a lifeline, a reason to continue when the larger picture seemed bleak. Even as the Germans pressed steadily forward, they were slowed by the human determination around them. Smolensk, surrounded and pressured, remained alive in the actions of those within, and as the days passed, the cauldron became less a trap and more a testament that even in defeat, endurance and courage could shape the story. The city waited, carrying the quiet pulse of resistance into the next chapter. By late August, the German advance began to lose the rhythm that had carried it so swiftly across Belarus. Roads once smooth under relentless movement were now churned into mud by endless convoys. Fuel supplies ran thin, and the engines of mechanized units groaned under the strain of distance. Soldiers walked more than they rode, their boots wearing down, their shoulders carrying the weight of both equipment and exhaustion. Horses too showed fatigue, their flanks slick with sweat, yet they pressed on beside wagons and carts. Communication faltered across long stretches of land, orders delayed or misinterpreted, slowing coordination. Even the air seemed heavier, carrying the faint scent of smoke, dust, and overused machinery. The forests and rivers offered obstacles, subtle but persistent, that made progress uneven and measured. In the midst of all this, Smolensk remained a silent witness, its walls and streets holding centuries of endurance, and the pause settled like a quiet breath over the land. The slowing advance revealed the limits of speed and force over long distances. German columns stretched thin, their supply lines fragile against the breadth of the territory. Trucks waited at crossroads, engines idling as supplies arrived in drips rather than floods. Soldiers marched on foot, their determination steady, but their pace slower with each mile. Rivers required bridging, bridges needed repair, and the surrounding forests hid both obstacles and threats. Each step forward became more deliberate, calculated against exhaustion, weather, and terrain. The wind carried the mingled scents of soil and vegetation, reminders that the land itself resisted complete domination. Horses grazed briefly, their presence a quiet anchor to the movement of men and machines alike. Even the distant sound of artillery seemed more measured now, less frequent than before. And in the calm that followed, the Wehrmacht discovered that speed alone could not conquer everything. Supply issues became tangible, shaping every decision in the field. Fuel depots ran low, rations dwindled, and wheels ground against the rough roads in protest. Officers adjusted plans to account for these limitations, slowing advances that had once seemed unstoppable. Soldiers improvised, carrying water in canteens, sharing bread, and finding shade beneath trees to rest. Horses, trained for long marches, were fed with care, their strength preserved to carry the burdens still required. Streams and wells became precious, used sparingly and shared among men and animals alike. The dust hung in the air like a haze, softening the outlines of the advancing columns. Even the forests whispered in response, their shadows stretching across the roads like gentle reminders of resistance. Each day became measured by supply, distance, and endurance rather than ambition. And through this slow rhythm, Smolensk revealed itself as more than a point on a map. It became a natural barrier, a test of patience. For soldiers in the front lines, the slowing tempo offered a mixed sense of relief and unease. The urgency of constant movement gave way to long stretches of waiting and cautious adjustment. Along the roads they paused beneath the trees, observing the land, the rivers, and the fields. Dust settled on faces and uniforms, forming a thin veil over the strain and fatigue. Horses chewed grass quietly, their breath soft in the warmth of late summer. Officers consulted maps, tracing routes and weighing options with careful consideration. Small fires were lit to prepare food, their smoke curling into the calm sky before being snuffed out to avoid attention. Every movement became deliberate, each step measured against endurance rather than speed. Even silence carried meaning, signaling both rest and anticipation. And in this pause, the soldiers learned a different rhythm of war, one slower but no less demanding. The land itself seemed to take part in this moment of hesitation. Rivers meandered lazily across fields, their banks holding pockets of shade and moisture. Forests offered cover but also slowed passage, roots, and undergrowth, demanding careful navigation. Fields, once swept by rapid columns, now bore the impressions of paused wheels and resting feet. Birds moved above, their wings casting soft shadows on the sun-warmed earth. The wind carried scents of grain, earth, and faint smoke, blending into a natural meditation on endurance. Even the roads seemed aware, their ruts deepened by previous movement, yet slowing progress with subtle resistance. Soldiers and horses moved in tandem with the land, adapting to its demands and its quiet rhythms. Each day brought small observations, quiet adjustments, and deliberate decisions. And through these observations, the advance became less a rush and more a careful negotiation with the terrain itself. Reflections on Smolensk became unavoidable as the city loomed ahead, quiet and watchful. Its walls and streets had endured past invasions, absorbing history into every stone. For the soldiers, the city represented both a goal and a delay, a point of progress that tested patience and planning. Families within and beyond its borders waited, sensing the approach yet accustomed to endurance. Bell towers, church spires, and rivers marked the city as a threshold, both a barrier and a promise of civilization. Soldiers moving slowly through fields felt the weight of generations, as if the land itself whispered caution. Even the air seemed softer here, carrying memory alongside the heat and dust. Each day closer to the city reminded the advance that movement was not merely about speed, but understanding. And in that understanding, a quiet respect for endurance replaced the earlier urgency. Smolensk demanded consideration, and the army slowed accordingly. For commanders, this pause revealed lessons in logistics, patience, and human limits. Units were reorganized, men and horses rested, and maps were carefully studied. Fuel shortages dictated slower, deliberate movement, requiring coordination across stretched lines. Soldiers adapted to the rhythm imposed by the terrain, weather, and supply, discovering resilience in small routines. Each day was punctuated by careful marches, shared meals, and attention to detail. Horses were groomed and fed, wheels repaired, and exhausted men tended to with quiet care. Even the forested edges of roads became teachers, reminding planners that nature held as much influence as strategy. The tempo had fallen, yet it allowed insight, reflection, and preparation for the next phase of the campaign. And through this slowing, the army learned that conquest was as much about endurance as speed. Smolensk had become a measured teacher, shaping the pace of history. By the end of this period, the Blitzkrieg's tempo had given way to a patient rhythm. Dust settled over roads and fields, carrying the scent of horses, soil, and the faint smoke of distant fires. Soldiers rested, wagons waited, and horses grazed quietly, all moving in a measured pattern dictated by circumstance. Officers marked maps with deliberation, choosing routes that conserved energy and resources. Rivers, forests, and fields exerted a subtle but persistent influence over movement and planning. Even the wind seemed slower, carrying whispers of endurance rather than urgency. Smolensk remained ahead, patient and unyielding, a barrier more in spirit than in stone. Each day passed with soft precision, teaching the army the quiet lessons of balance, timing, and respect for distance. And as the tempo fell, the story of the city became clearer. Smolensk was not merely a battlefield, but a slow breathing force shaping the course of history. The pause lingered, carrying reflection and anticipation into the days that followed. In the quiet of the Kremlin, Stalin's presence weighed heavily over maps and reports, each sheet a testament to both loss and opportunity. The reports of retreat and encirclement arrived in measured stacks, their words heavy with the strain of reality. Generals and aides spoke in hushed tones, careful to measure each statement, yet the urgency of their content pressed like heat against the walls. Orders were drafted with precision, demanding counterattacks that would reclaim initiative even as the front teetered. Soldiers far from the capital could not yet sense the intensity of command, only the ripple of decisions carried down through channels of authority. Rivers and forests, hills and fields, All became stages for plans that were sometimes abstract, but always absolute. Even in the midst of disorder, there was a clarity to the central will, a stubborn insistence that the tide could be turned. The air seemed charged, carrying the weight of both expectation and consequence. Decisions were made with both calculation and instinct, balancing desperation against discipline. And through it all, the pulse of command moved steadily outward, touching every corner of the threatened front. Orders traveled slowly along stretched lines, first on paper, then carried by riders and telegraphs, whispering urgency into distant garrisons. Each unit received instructions meant to inspire action, even as resources dwindled and roads remained clogged. Officers read, reread, and interpreted these commands, aware of both the risk and the responsibility they carried. Soldiers moved under the shadow of a distant figure whose presence was felt rather than seen. Horses and wagons bore not only men and supplies, but also the invisible weight of expectation. Streams offered refreshment, forests provided cover, and fields bore the footprints of determination pressed into soil. Even exhaustion seemed less a barrier than a reminder of duty, a call to act despite fatigue. Men whispered encouragements to one another, small rhythms of solidarity beneath the larger force of command. And as these orders traveled, they gathered weight, shaping the movements of the Red Army across the landscape. The pulse of leadership became a quiet force, binding disparate elements into fragile coherence. In Moscow, Stalin's focus never wavered, a constant pressure on every decision made below. Maps were studied, projections calculated, and contingencies considered in endless repetition. The paradox of control became evident, ruthlessness tempered by necessity, demanding sacrifices yet striving to preserve the line. Soldiers, unaware of the man behind the commands, felt the consequences in each movement ordered and each counterattack pressed. Supplies were marshaled where they could, reinforcements moved with urgency, and exhausted units were urged forward. Horses trotted under the strain of heavy loads, their discipline mirrored by the men they carried. Even the wind seemed to pause in the city, carrying the stillness of calculation into the corridors of power. Reports of success and failure arrived in measured bursts, each shaping the next command with subtle influence. The paradox persisted, brutal insistence, yet a lifeline to those fighting at the edge, and so the army moved, a hesitant river guided by a single relentless hand. Far from Moscow, Soviet officers received orders with both hope and apprehension. Counterattacks were to be launched along select points, even if the resources were scarce and the ground uncertain. Soldiers readied themselves, not always understanding the full intention, but sensing the importance of action. Wagons and trucks creaked under loads, engines strained against dusty roads, and horses pressed steadily onward. Along forested paths, men whispered the names of fallen comrades and the prayers of home, threading courage into the movements dictated by distant command. Even rivers became conduits of movement, allowing crossings where none had seemed possible before. Small successes were celebrated quietly, moments of rhythm in an otherwise unpredictable day. And though each order carried the weight of risk, it also carried a measure of hope, a promise that the tide might yet be held. The front, once fracturing, began to find fragile coherence. Each step forward reflected both fear and determination. In the heart of Smolensk, the soldiers sensed the shift. Though they could not name its source, movements became more deliberate, resistance coordinated in ways that suggested oversight and intent. Beyond the immediate battlefield, officers moved with renewed clarity, guiding units through narrow paths, across fields, and along crowded roads. The rhythm of marching, resting, and advancing returned with quiet insistence, subtle yet persistent. Streams and wells offered refreshment, Forests provided concealment, and each day brought the careful repetition of duties. Horses, wagons, and soldiers alike fell into the pattern, a chain of endurance stretching across the land. Even the city itself seemed to acknowledge the change, its streets and walls holding a steady presence beneath the tension. Families and civilians moved with purpose, small acts of cooperation reflecting the larger pulse of organization. And in the midst of chaos, the quiet insistence of command shaped action, tying disparate lives together into a single rhythm. Smolensk became not only a battlefield, but a stage for resilience, guided by the pulse of leadership. Supply lines, fragile though they were, began to stretch toward new organization under Stalin's direction. Fuel, food, and ammunition were allocated with urgency, often arriving just in time to sustain movement. Soldiers shared resources where scarcity remained, improvising with care to preserve both life and momentum. Horses were fed, harnesses adjusted, and wagons repaired to maintain the fragile flow of support. Even the wind seemed to carry the weight of intention, rustling leaves along paths and roads in quiet accompaniment. Officers coordinated positions and reserves, adjusting tactics to the rhythm of both enemy advance and internal readiness. Each river crossing, each forested path, each field became part of a larger plan, subtle yet deliberate. Soldiers whispered encouragement, shared bread, and kept watch with renewed attention. And through the coordination, the front began to steady, small sparks of cohesion appearing amidst uncertainty. The pulse of command shaped the land as much as the men upon it. In Moscow, decisions balanced risk and necessity with careful persistence. Generals reported, strategists calculated, and Stalin measured each moment with an eye to both immediacy and consequence. Counterattacks were ordered along vulnerable points, a mixture of force and timing meant to slow, disrupt, and reclaim initiative. Soldiers far from the capital felt the effects in every step, each movement a reflection of distant resolve. Horses and wagons carried the necessities of life, bridging gaps between orders and execution. Rivers, forests, and roads dictated rhythm, each obstacle requiring patience and subtle adaptation. Even the hum of daily activity seemed guided by a larger force, a current of purpose that bound men, women, and animals alike. Small victories were noted quietly, celebrated with measured relief rather than fanfare. And in this quiet resurgence, the paradox of leadership became clear: ruthlessness tempered with attention, demand balanced with necessity, and hope threaded through exhaustion. Smolensk remained under pressure, yet the pulse of resistance had begun to steady. By the end of this period, the Red Army began to respond with coordination shaped by both fear and resolve. Orders carried across rivers, forests, and rutted roads were implemented with patient determination. Soldiers pressed forward, horses moved steadily, and wagons creaked under the weight of supplies essential for survival. Streams offered refreshment, and fields provided momentary respite, each element woven into a larger pattern of endurance. Even the smallest actions, sharing water, tending a harness, passing a whispered warning, became part of the rhythm of organized resistance. The paradox persisted: ruthlessness, discipline, and human perseverance intertwined, holding together a front that might otherwise have fractured entirely. Smolensk's presence remained a constant, a measure of both endurance and consequence, and as the city waited, the pulse of the Red Army began to rise, slow but steady, shaping the land and preparing for the next chapter of struggle. Leadership, distance, and determination converged quietly, yet decisively, in the unfolding story. Smolensk, ancient and patient, felt the first tremors of destruction ripple through its streets. Fires flickered in the distance, smoke curling upward in thin, hesitant spirals that blurred the horizon. Soldiers moved through the city with careful precision, navigating rubble and obstacles as if each step were measured against memory itself. The air carried the mingled scents of dust, wood, and scorched stone, soft yet persistent. Families huddled quietly in cellars, whispering names and prayers, while listening to the rhythm of distant bombardments. Horses paused, nostrils flaring, as wagons creaked along uneven roads filled with debris. Even in the midst of chaos, the city seemed to breathe slowly, absorbing the strain without complaint. Streets became narrow corridors, shifting under the weight of human and animal movement. Each step taken was both forward and into the past, carrying traces of lives lived and moments lost. And as night approached, the fires glimmered like distant stars, reminding all of both fragility and endurance. Buildings that had stood for centuries now leaned quietly under pressure, their walls etched with the marks of time and conflict. Windows were darkened, doors removed, yet the presence of life remained, hidden but unbroken. Soldiers guided families through twisted streets, sharing food, water, and words of reassurance that moved like soft wind through alleys. Horses and wagons pressed forward, leaving temporary trails in the dust that would vanish with the next storm. Smoke drifted across rooftops, curling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, whispering of change and survival. Children clung to blankets and to the hands of their elders, absorbing stories even as the city shifted around them. The scent of scorched timber mixed with the faint sweetness of ripening grain, a quiet reminder of what remained untouched. Even in the collapse of streets and walls, the pulse of Smolensk continued, subtle but perceptible. Small fires reflected against brick and stone, creating a rhythm of light and shadow that carried memory forward. And through it all, the city held itself, a patient witness to endurance amid destruction. The rhythm of movement within the city changed, measured by both caution and necessity. Soldiers guided the weary along paths cleared of rubble, pausing to rest beneath trees or in shadowed doorways. Horses drank from wells, their movements careful, deliberate, preserving strength for the journey still to come. Civilians, too, moved quietly, clutching bundles and whispered confidences as they navigated streets lined with fractured buildings. Dust hung softly in the air, settling on hair, clothing, and skin like a gentle veil. Smoke from distant fires carried the faint scent of burned timber and earth, blending with the warmth of late summer. Even the wind seemed to slow, rustling leaves in a rhythm that echoed human persistence. Messages were shared in hushed tones, instructions passed from one household to another in quiet determination, and each step taken, whether by soldier or civilian, carried both care and courage into the changing cityscape. Smolensk endured, shifting beneath the weight of its own history and the pressure of the present. Horses and wagons moved steadily, threading through streets fractured by fire and shell. Wheels ground against stone and dust, carrying food, water, and the fragile weight of hope. Soldiers paused to adjust harnesses and supplies, their faces marked by sweat and resolve. Even as the city seemed to tremble under distant bombardments, the rhythm of life persisted, measured in small, deliberate motions. Families shared whispered encouragements as they moved along broken paths, offering water, bread, and guidance to one another. The wind carried a mixture of warmth, dust, and smoke, threading through alleys and courtyards with gentle insistence. Each step forward became a meditation on persistence, a quiet act of human endurance in a city tested beyond measure. Horses chewed grass when opportunity allowed, grounding the day with slow, steady motion, and in the pause between movement, the city seemed to sigh softly, absorbing the presence of life, still persevering within its fractured form. Even destruction held a rhythm, quiet and enduring. Soldiers and civilians alike found moments of quiet heroism amidst the rubble. A child guided past a fallen wall, a bundle of bread shared between strangers, a horse given water before the rider drank. These small acts were carried out with gentle determination, unnoticed in the larger sweep of the city, yet vital in sustaining the fragile pulse of life. Dust clung to uniforms and clothing, layering each movement with a tactile memory of endurance. Smoke from fires shifted with the breeze, twisting through alleys and open squares, a soft reminder of both loss and resilience. Families whispered stories of summers past, of quiet evenings and distant rivers, threading memory into the present struggle. Soldiers shared water and encouragement, keeping pace with wagons and animals moving slowly across streets, strewn with debris. Even the wind seemed to carry caution, rustling leaves softly over the broken surfaces of the city. And through all of this, Smolensk remained patient, its ruins cradling life, its streets absorbing movement. The city itself endured as witness, reflecting the quiet persistence of its inhabitants. The sound of distant bombardment carried not only danger but rhythm, a slow pulse threading through each street and alley. Soldiers adjusted their pace, guiding both companions and civilians with deliberate care. Horses moved steadily, harnesses creaking in measured cadence, responding to soft commands. Smoke rose in thin veils, tracing paths over rooftops and through open squares, whispering across the air with quiet insistence. Children clung to the hands of elders, carrying blankets and whispered stories, small vessels of memory within the shifting city. Dust settled gently, coating surfaces, softening edges, and framing the movement of human and animal alike. Even the scent of scorched wood held notes of endurance, blending with the faint aroma of ripening grain, untouched by fire. Each step forward became a meditation on survival, a rhythm of determination measured in breaths and quiet actions. And as the day waned, the city seemed to exhale softly, carrying the lives of its inhabitants into a night of watchfulness and calm. Smolensk's heartbeat persisted, steady beneath the pressures of war. Families and soldiers found brief reprieves in shadowed corners and cellars, moments where exhaustion met reflection. Water was shared, food divided, and stories whispered to maintain the fragile pulse of courage. Horses rested, their breaths soft and measured, anchoring the rhythm of movement around them. Even the wind slowed, brushing across rubble and streets with gentle insistence. Smoke from distant fires traced delicate lines across the sky, fading as evening approached. Soldiers whispered names of comrades, prayers for protection, and quiet encouragement to those beside them. Dust settled slowly, muting edges, softening sounds, and cushioning footsteps. Each act, no matter how small, contributed to the city's continued endurance, threading life through stone and memory. And in this rhythm, a fragile hope persisted, binding together lives, scattered across streets, marked by fire. Smolensk remained, a city both scarred and enduring, carrying its story forward into the next chapter of struggle. By evening, the city was quiet but alive, breathing beneath the soft glow of fires and the fading light of day. Streets were filled with slow, deliberate movement. Soldiers guiding wagons, civilians carrying supplies, horses pausing to rest. Dust and smoke mingled in the air, settling into soft layers over brick, stone, and soil. Families huddled together, whispering names and prayers, threading memory and courage into their continued presence. Soldiers shared small comforts with one another, each act a quiet assertion of life in the midst of ruin. Even the wind seemed to hum softly, threading through alleys and courtyards, carrying the persistence of endurance. Each step taken, each pause to rest, became part of the rhythm of survival that defined the city at this moment. Smolensk, fragile yet enduring, absorbed every movement, every breath, and every whispered hope. And as night fell, the city seemed to cradle its inhabitants gently, carrying them forward toward the next chapter. Life persisted, quiet and measured, beneath the weight of memory and fire. Along the roads leading out of Smolensk, dust rose in soft, curling columns as survivors moved steadily away from the city's fractured streets. Families clutched bundles of clothing, small possessions, and whispered memories as they threaded along paths both familiar and uncertain. Horses, still weary from long marches and heavy loads, carried wagons filled with provisions and supplies salvaged from the rubble. Soldiers slipped through forests and fields, moving quietly, each step measured against the weight of exhaustion and hope. The air smelled of earth, dust, and lingering smoke, carrying faint traces of the city they left behind. Trees provided shade and cover, their leaves rustling gently as if whispering encouragement to those passing beneath. Children walked alongside elders, their small hands holding tight, absorbing stories and fragments of history in every step. Even in the midst of retreat, small acts of care persisted, water shared, words of comfort exchanged, moments of rest observed. The rhythm of movement was deliberate, soft and steady, a quiet assertion of life amid upheaval. And in the unfolding road ahead, the survivors carried both memory and persistence, like a fragile lantern. Rivers and streams became natural companions for those moving through the countryside, their waters offering refreshment and solace. Soldiers paused to refill canteens while horses drank gently, careful to conserve strength for the miles still to come. Dust clung to clothing and skin, forming a soft layer that marked each step, each pause, and each act of endurance. Families whispered names and stories, the cadence of voices weaving reassurance into the quiet air. Fields stretched on either side, dotted with occasional patches of shade, their grasses brushing against tired legs and wheels. Even the wind seemed to carry patience, bending trees and stirring leaves with gentle insistence. Paths through forests were uneven, roots and undergrowth demanding attention while providing quiet cover. Each day passed in measured steps, each night offered a chance to rest and reflect, carrying the soft weight of survival. And as the roads unfolded, the distant city seemed to fade, leaving memory and determination to guide every movement forward. The journey itself became both refuge and meditation, a rhythm of quiet endurance. Along narrow tracks and forest edges, small groups moved together, bound by shared necessity and instinctive trust. Soldiers guided civilians across fields, whispered instructions for safety, and offered reassurance in low, steady tones. Horses carried wagons of provisions, their presence a quiet anchor amid uncertainty. Dust rose gently from the trodden paths, swirling around boots, wheels, and hooves like a soft curtain. Children, still learning the rhythms of survival, moved alongside adults, their small steps synchronized with the pace of the group. Streams and wells provided the occasional refreshment, their waters cool and soothing against tired hands and faces. The trees overhead swayed with gentle encouragement, their leaves murmuring softly in the wind. Even in moments of pause, the quiet pulse of movement persisted, unbroken and deliberate. Each step forward carried traces of the city behind, and hints of the unknown ahead. And in this passage, life endured with subtle insistence, guided by patience and care. Occasionally, smoke from distant fires rose into the sky, a reminder of what had been left behind. Soldiers and civilians alike acknowledged it quietly, neither rushing nor lingering, their focus drawn to the path ahead. Horses nibbled grass, where the road allowed, regaining strength for the continued journey. Families shared small meals, dividing bread and water with careful thought, threading comfort into necessity. Dust and sweat mingled with the warmth of late summer, layering each movement with tactile memory. The forest provided both protection and challenge, its shadows stretching long across the path as sunlight filtered through branches. Every step forward required attention, cooperation, and patience, each small act forming part of a larger rhythm. Even moments of quiet rest were infused with vigilance, soft murmurs of conversation accompanying the gentle breathing of those around. And in the unbroken flow of travel, hope persisted quietly, carried in footsteps, in whispers, and in the steady pulse of horses' hooves. The roads themselves seemed to hum with endurance, guiding the living onward. Soldiers moving along these roads carried not only the weight of gear, but also the responsibility of guiding others safely. Instructions were given in measured tones, attention focused on footing, pace, and the presence of obstacles. Horses paused at streams and small wells, their movements slow, deliberate, preserving energy for miles yet to come. Families whispered prayers and names, threading memory and courage into each moment. Dust clung to faces and clothing, softening the outlines of exhaustion and smoothing the edges of fear. Trees offered temporary shade, birds provided quiet company, and the rhythm of footsteps and hooves maintained a gentle cadence. Even the wind seemed to move with care, brushing across faces and stirring the undergrowth in encouragement. Each step forward was both a surrender and a choice, a quiet acceptance of circumstance and a commitment to perseverance. And through this quiet determination, the survivors carried life steadily, one measured pace at a time. The path ahead, though uncertain, was traversed with patience and quiet resilience. Along forest paths, soldiers slipped unseen, observing the subtle changes in the land as they moved. Fallen leaves and branches whispered underfoot, guiding movement while softening noise. Horses grazed and rested when possible, their strength preserved for moments of need. Families tucked themselves into natural cover, finding brief respite and maintaining the rhythm of travel. Dust clung to every surface, creating a tangible memory of the journey and the endurance it required. Streams meandered through fields and woods, their waters offering refreshment and a momentary pause in movement. Children learned to measure steps with adults, synchronizing small motions with the steady rhythm of travel. Even the wind carried stories, brushing across paths and foliage, leaving a soft sense of continuity in its passage. And as day turned to evening, the survivors moved with gentle perseverance, each step echoing the quiet determination that defined their escape. Life, fragile yet persistent, continued to thread its way through every mile. The landscape stretched, alternating between open fields, narrow forest paths, and winding country roads. Each step forward was accompanied by careful observation. Streams, undergrowth, and uneven ground marked the rhythm of movement. Horses carried the weary, wagons held provisions, and soldiers guided those who required steady hands and reassurance. Dust and the faint scent of smoke from distant fires mingled in the air, softening the harsh edges of reality. Families walked in small clusters, whispering names and stories, threading courage and memory into the journey. Trees overhead swayed in gentle rhythm, their leaves murmuring softly to the passage below. Even the softest moments of rest were filled with subtle attentiveness, each pause balanced with preparation, and as the roads unfolded, the survivors learned patience, endurance, and quiet resourcefulness, carrying these lessons with each step forward. The land itself seemed to guide them, offering both obstacles and shelter in measured rhythm. And in the steady movement, life persisted, soft and unbroken, toward a horizon yet unseen. By the end of this passage, the roads themselves seemed to hum with quiet persistence. Soldiers, civilians, and horses had moved as one, a measured rhythm threading life through the landscape. Dust and sweat mingled with the scents of forest and river, settling on every surface like a gentle memory. Streams, trees, and fields marked the path, offering both challenge and solace in even measure. Families whispered stories, shared sustenance, and carried one another forward, threading human resilience through every mile. Horses moved with soft determination, responding to careful guidance from those who relied upon them. Each step, each pause, and each shared act of care became part of a subtle rhythm that carried everyone toward continued survival. Even the wind seemed to participate, brushing across faces, rustling leaves, and carrying the pulse of life forward. And as night approached, the roads held the quiet heartbeat of endurance, guiding survivors toward the days that awaited beyond the immediate horizon. Life persisted softly, carrying memory, hope, and resilience along every measured step. In the quiet of his headquarters, far from the smoke and dust of Smolensk, Hitler paused over maps and reports. His generals whispered possibilities, each suggesting a different path, yet the urgency of the campaign had softened under the weight of delay. Moscow beckoned like a distant promise, Kiev offered security and resources, and Leningrad lingered at the edges of thought, a northern challenge waiting patiently. The city of Smolensk, stubborn and enduring, had forced a pause that resonated through every corridor of decision. Soldiers in the field sensed the slowing of orders, the subtle hesitation that rippled through supply lines and movements. Even the forests and rivers beyond the city seemed to press upon the mind, quiet reminders of resistance that did not roar but persisted. Decisions hung in balance, measured in hours and days rather than the previous rush of advance. The air within the headquarters seemed heavy with contemplation, thick with the scent of paper, ink, and concentration. Each suggestion was weighed with care, the mind shifting between urgency and caution. And as the pause lengthened, history seemed to hold its breath, suspended between choice and consequence. Outside the headquarters, German units moved with restrained efficiency, their rhythm slower than before, guided by deliberate intent rather than momentum. Horses trotted patiently, wagons creaked along roads softened by dust, and officers paused to consult maps and make quiet adjustments. The land itself seemed to echo the tension, rivers reflecting sunlight in still pools, forests swaying gently as if in contemplation. Soldiers whispered among themselves, sensing the unusual stillness, their steps careful and unhurried. Each movement carried awareness of possibility, uncertainty threading through actions previously governed by force and speed. Dust hung softly in the air, layering each motion with a subtle weight of anticipation. Even the wind seemed to pause, rustling leaves with measured attention, carrying no urgency but gentle insistence. The city of Smolensk lingered behind them, a silent teacher in the art of delay and persistence. Roads stretched forward, carrying the weight of potential decisions, each mile a quiet negotiation with circumstance. And in this calm, the army moved thoughtfully, guided by a temporary stillness that would shape days to come. Within the maps, markers, and reports, the tension of choice was almost tangible. Moscow's spires seemed to shine with possibility, Kiev's plains offered order and sustenance, while Leningrad's approach hinted at strategic patience. The generals debated softly, their voices measured, reflecting both hope and caution. Even those far from headquarters felt the subtle slowing of the campaign, a rhythm tempered by indecision. Soldiers in the field adjusted to this change, their movements synchronized with the new cadence dictated by the minds above. Horses grazed along the edges of roads, sensing the lack of immediate urgency, while wagons moved steadily but without haste. Streams and forests along the route offered both respite and gentle challenge, echoing the quiet deliberation above. The weight of delay pressed gently on all who moved within the campaign, threading uncertainty into every step, and through it, the city of Smolensk remained patient, holding its influence not through force but through quiet endurance. The pause itself became a moment of reflection, both for the invader and the land. At night the headquarters hummed with soft activity, whispered consultations, the turning of pages, and the occasional tapping of pen on map. Outside, the wind stirred trees and grasses with a slow, rhythmic motion, carrying the scent of earth and summer into every corner. Soldiers rested along roadsides, aware of a pause that felt different, a time when movement was less about urgency and more about anticipation. Horses settled quietly, ears twitching at the faintest sounds, their breaths measured and soft. Officers shared quiet words, recalculating distances, supply and potential paths, threading strategy with patience. Even the distant forests seemed to lean into the rhythm, branches brushing against one another with subtle insistence. Dust settled over roads and fields, softening edges and marking time in fine layers. The pause allowed small observations, birds calling across distant fields, rivers catching fading sunlight, and the distant echo of a movement slowed. And as night deepened, the air itself seemed to wait, carrying both expectation and reflection in its gentle currents. The choice had yet to be made, and time itself moved softly with it. The generals continued to present arguments in careful succession, each word weighted by consequence. Moscow, Kiev, Leningrad, each held distinct promise, each concealed hidden risk. Maps were traced repeatedly, calculations checked and rechecked, while the distant city of Smolensk persisted like a quiet sentinel. Soldiers felt the shift in pace, each command slightly delayed, each march measured against caution rather than speed. Horses moved with quiet awareness, wagons creaked under careful loads, and small acts of adjustment became the rhythm of daily survival. Even the landscape seemed to respond to the pause, rivers flowing with deliberate calm, forests rustling gently in the wind, and fields stretching slowly beneath a soft sun. Dust clung to faces, clothing and wheels, recording the passage of time with subtle insistence. In this moment the campaign felt less like force, and more like a negotiation with the land, history and circumstance. And as deliberation continued, a fragile balance held the narrative of the advance in gentle suspension. The choice lingered, allowing space for reflection, doubt, and unseen consequence. Outside, German units adjusted to the tempo, moving with quiet precision rather than relentless urgency. Soldiers whispered, sharing observations about rivers, fields, and forest edges, threading awareness into each step. Horses grazed, wagons rolled slowly, and roads stretched into the distance with gentle insistence. Dust swirled softly in warm sunlight, clinging to boots and harnesses, blending with the sense of earth and distant smoke. Even in motion there was a sense of waiting, a recognition that progress was shaped as much by choice as by speed. Civilians glimpsed columns passing quietly, aware of the stillness that carried a weight of its own. The landscape itself seemed to inhale, carrying patience in every rustling leaf, in every ripple of river, in every shifting shadow. And as the hours passed, the pause persisted, a quiet force threading thought through action, hesitation through movement. Smolensk lingered behind, influencing not through arms but through endurance. History itself seemed to hover gently in the balance, waiting for the next command to tip the scales. The weight of decision rested in the minds of those far from battle, yet it stretched into every step along the roads and fields. Soldiers, wagons, and horses moved in soft harmony, each element aware of the slower rhythm imposed from above. Dust settled slowly over earth and stone, creating a quiet layer of time and memory. Streams, forests, and fields echoed the patience, guiding movement with subtle insistence. Officers whispered instructions, soldiers carried them with care, and civilians navigated both terrain and circumstance with steady determination. Even the wind seemed to carry understanding, brushing across the land with gentle insistence. Each day passed measuredly, each hour marked by the soft rhythm of anticipation, and through it all, the city of Smolensk remained, a quiet sentinel shaping thought, pace, and perception. Choices hung suspended, poised between action and reflection, and in this calm history paused, holding its breath for what was yet to come. Across the fields and forests near Smolensk, small bands of Soviet soldiers began to stir with quiet determination. Their movements were deliberate, measured, and often cautious, threading through paths that had already seen disruption and retreat. Even when faced with superior numbers, these soldiers carried an unspoken insistence to act, to resist, and to leave their mark on a landscape weighed by conflict. Horses and wagons moved alongside them when possible, each step a balance of caution and persistence. Dust rose slowly from every movement, curling around legs, hooves, and wheels, creating a soft haze over the terrain. Streams and forests offered temporary cover, their waters and shadows blending with the rhythm of motion. Soldiers whispered encouragement to one another, small words of reassurance carrying farther than might have been expected. Even the air seemed to hum with their presence, a subtle vibration of endurance threading through the quiet landscape. Each effort, however fleeting, became a spark in the darkness, fragile yet persistent, and through these small counterattacks, a pulse of resistance began to emerge, gentle but unmistakable. Orders flowed down from higher command with a mixture of urgency and care. The generals knew that these movements might be crushed, yet they carried the weight of necessity and intent. Soldiers moved through broken roads, navigating fields and patches of forest that had become familiar, yet still unpredictable. Horses paused at streams to drink, while wagons carried small loads of supplies, ensuring that every act of movement was sustained. Dust settled in thin layers over uniforms, clothing, and the soil itself, marking the passage of time and effort. Even in retreat or temporary defeat, the Red Army persisted in small, methodical rhythms, asserting presence in spaces others might have deemed lost. Civilians watched quietly from the edges of villages, noting the flickers of activity that hinted at life refusing to disappear. Branches rustled softly underfoot, leaves whispered in the wind, and each subtle sound seemed to carry the memory of movement and effort. And as day yielded to evening, these small actions continued, forming a quiet tapestry of persistence. The land itself absorbed the pulse of the soldiers, threading endurance through every mile traveled. Through forests and open fields, soldiers pressed forward in measured bursts. Each step required attention, patience, and careful calculation, as the possibility of encounter with enemy forces was never far away. Horses grazed quietly, replenishing strength between movements, while wagons creaked along rough paths under the weight of careful supplies. Dust mixed with the scent of pine and soil, coating faces and clothing with the tactile memory of movement. Soldiers whispered names of comrades, recalling past moments of guidance and protection, and these whispers became small lifelines of courage. Even the wind seemed to hold its rhythm gently, rustling through leaves and across meadows with subtle insistence. Streams offered refreshment, and patches of shade provided temporary respite for both men and animals alike. Each act of motion, each pause, carried with it the quiet insistence that life, organization, and resistance could persist even under pressure. And though many of these efforts would be halted or dispersed, they left traces of determination etched into the landscape. The pulse of the Red Army, small but steady, began to weave itself into the rhythm of the land. In villages scattered around Smolensk, local inhabitants observed movements with quiet fascination and relief. Soldiers, even when briefly halted, carried the sense of purpose with them, threading reassurance into the consciousness of those who watched. Horses stepped carefully along roads, their harnesses creaking softly, each step measured and deliberate. Dust rose in the warmth of sunlight, coating the edges of streets, stones, and walls with a soft patina. Children peeked from doorways, observing the careful coordination of movement that seemed both fragile and inevitable. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering encouragement to those passing beneath. Small acts of kindness, shared water, and murmured guidance flowed quietly among soldiers and civilians alike. Even in moments of brief retreat, the rhythm of persistence remained, subtle yet perceptible, carrying forward the essence of resilience. And as evening drew near, the scattered counterattacks left faint trails of presence across fields and forest paths. These traces spoke softly of refusal to disappear, of life asserting itself amid uncertainty. Night brought its own rhythm, a gentle darkness that softened edges and carried quiet reflection. Soldiers rested in small groups, sharing warmth, water, and whispered words of encouragement. Horses huddled in corners, breathing slow and measured, anchoring the rhythm of movement to steady presence. Dust settled gently across uniforms, wheels, and ground, creating a layer of quiet memory over the day's effort. Even the wind slowed, rustling leaves and brushing along forest edges in soft, persistent patterns. Small fires glimmered briefly in the distance, providing warmth and comfort without drawing undue attention. Messages passed quietly between groups, instructions carried by footsteps and soft voices, threading coordination across the night. And in this pause the land itself seemed to listen, absorbing the pulse of determination and endurance that moved beneath its surface. Each effort, though modest, reinforced the sense that the Red Army, though tested, would not vanish quietly. In the stillness, the promise of continued resistance shimmered like a faint, enduring light. As dawn approached, movements resumed with gentle insistence. Soldiers emerged from shadowed cover, stepping lightly along familiar paths, guided by instinct and previous experience. Horses grazed briefly, wagons rolled slowly over rutted roads, and the soft rhythm of travel threaded through meadows, forests, and streams. Dust hung lightly in the air, illuminated by the early sun, giving form to the subtle pulse of motion. Voices were quiet but resolute, whispers of direction and encouragement blending into the morning's soft chorus. Even the landscape seemed to guide them, fields and forests bending subtly to the rhythm of passage. Streams reflected gentle light, offering refreshment and a momentary pause, anchoring the movement with softness. Each act of motion, each careful advance, carried the unspoken assertion that presence and resistance could endure despite adversity. And as the day unfolded, these small counterattacks continued, each one a ripple of persistence across a land marked by previous struggle. The Red Army's pulse strengthened quietly, measured and deliberate, threading determination through every corner of the terrain. In the quiet intervals between skirmishes, soldiers observed and adapted to the land. Forests offered concealment and measured challenge, rivers shaped the paths of movement, and fields demanded patience. Horses and wagons moved in sync with careful guidance, each step contributing to the rhythm of endurance. Dust settled softly over every surface, leaving a gentle imprint of passage and presence. Even the wind carried a quiet insistence, brushing across leaves, tall grasses, and stone with persistent subtlety. Soldiers whispered and shared supplies, small gestures of care threading human warmth through each movement. Civilians noted the persistence, feeling the reassurance of life continuing amidst uncertainty, and as evening approached, the scattered efforts formed a quiet network of resistance, fragile yet undeniable. Each spark of action, small though it was, reinforced the steady pulse of the Red Army, and through all these subtle movements, the land itself seemed to resonate with the quiet determination of those who refused to vanish. By the close of this period, the rhythm of small counterattacks had become a steady, whispering pulse. Soldiers moved with patience, care, and deliberate intent, threading endurance through the fields, forests, and streams of Smolensk's surroundings. Horses and wagons maintained slow, persistent progress, anchoring the movement with measured presence. Dust and the faint scent of earth and distant fire coated every surface, leaving tangible memory of passage. Civilians observed and participated where possible, threading care and sustenance into the flow of action. Even the wind, rustling leaves, and stirring grass seemed to carry acknowledgement of quiet persistence. Each step, each whispered word, each act of careful motion became part of a subtle rhythm that shaped the landscape itself. And in this gentle insistence, the Red Army's resilience became visible, not in grand gestures, but in the steady pulse threading life across every mile. Smolensk's surroundings hummed softly with presence, a testament to the quiet refusal of disappearance. And through these small movements, the land, the soldiers, and the people all carried the promise of endurance forward, softly, persistently, into the days to come. In quiet rooms far from the roar of battle, German generals gathered around tables heavy with maps and reports. Their voices were measured but firm, each opinion carrying the weight of both experience and ambition. Moscow seemed close yet distant, a destination that promised glory but demanded caution. Some argued for immediate advance, pressing the army forward with a forceful certainty that only momentum could justify. Others counseled patience, warning that overextension and exhaustion might erode gains already achieved. The city of Smolensk, scarred yet unyielding, had created this pause, a space where strategy could bend and shift under human temperaments. Outside the rooms, the land itself moved quietly beneath the warm summer sun, rivers reflecting soft light, forests swaying with gentle rhythm. Soldiers in the field sensed the subtle changes in orders, adapting to shifts in pace with quiet diligence. Dust rose softly from roads and paths, a slow reminder of movement constrained by thought as well as terrain. And as discussions continued, history seemed to pause with them, suspended in the tension between decision and consequence. Soviet commanders, distant yet alert, observed their own forces with similar care, noting the ways modern warfare had reshaped the landscape. Troops moved in measured formations, testing boundaries and learning the subtle interplay of offense and defense. Horses and wagons threaded slowly through fields, streams, and forests, their rhythm gentle but persistent. Dust hung in the warm air, carrying the sense of soil, sweat, and distant fires, a reminder of both effort and endurance. Soldiers whispered among themselves, passing instructions and observations, absorbing lessons through movement and quiet reflection. Even the trees seemed to participate in the rhythm, branches brushing against one another with soft insistence. Every action, no matter how small, offered insight into the unfolding strategy, threading knowledge into future decisions. Civilians watched from the edges of villages, noting the careful advance and subtle withdrawals, absorbing the sense of planning that unfolded in the shadows. And in these observations, both sides felt the weight of history pressing gently, urging care, caution, and thoughtful choice. The learning of war, like the movement of land, flowed slowly, yet inevitably forward. Debate among the German generals stretched into long hours, measured by careful consideration rather than haste. Maps were traced repeatedly, lines redrawn, and possibilities calculated with precision and patience. Moscow glimmered in imagination, Kiev held promise, and Leningrad lingered as a strategic question yet to be answered. Soldiers outside adjusted to the slow rhythm, moving deliberately, their steps threaded with awareness of both command and circumstance. Horses grazed quietly, wagons creaked over uneven ground, and dust rose in gentle clouds along the paths of motion. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, stirring leaves and grasses in soft, measured pulses. The pause allowed subtle observation, reflection, and insight, threads of thought weaving through the fabric of the campaign. Civilians noted the changes with quiet attentiveness, sensing the shifting tides of decision from afar. And in the quiet tension, the personalities of command became intertwined with strategy, a reminder that history was shaped by both land and mind. Each choice, however small, rippled outward, carrying with it the weight of consequence in gentle, persistent waves. Back in the fields and forests around Smolensk, Soviet forces tested the edges of possibility with cautious probing attacks. Soldiers advanced slowly, retreating when necessary, learning to read the landscape as much as the enemy. Dust rose gently beneath boots, wheels, and hooves, marking a rhythm that was both deliberate and adaptive. Streams offered quiet pauses, forests provided cover, and open fields became lessons in exposure and movement. Officers whispered guidance, soldiers observed carefully, and every minor engagement offered insight into the new dimensions of modern combat. Horses moved steadily, wagons carried supplies, and small moments of respite allowed reflection on lessons learned. Even the wind seemed to murmur encouragement, brushing across meadows and woods, threading subtle rhythm through every step. Civilians, scattered and cautious, observed the patterns of motion and pause, absorbing the flow of strategy in quiet observation. And as these small actions accumulated, the Red Army's understanding deepened, each step forward threading knowledge and persistence into the land. Within the headquarters of German command, disagreement persisted yet remained unhurried, a slow unfolding of perspectives rather than confrontation. Officers traced possible routes, their fingers lingering over rivers, roads, and forests, contemplating both strength and vulnerability. Dust filtered in through open windows, settling softly on maps, papers, and boots, recording the passage of contemplative time. Soldiers in the field adjusted subtly to each shift in order, their steps and pacing guided by careful consideration from above. Even the sun seemed to pause, lingering over the edges of fields and rivers with golden patience. Conversations were quiet yet insistent, threading experience, ambition, and foresight into a complex web of choice. Horses moved with calm precision, wagons creaked slowly over roads softened by dust, and small units tested the boundaries of terrain with gentle intent. Civilians carried on nearby, noticing the patterns without understanding their full meaning, yet feeling the weight of quiet decision in the rhythm of the day. And through all of this, history seemed to stretch, unbroken, allowing reflection, debate, and measured action to shape what was yet to come. Each moment became a quiet negotiation between possibility and consequence, patience and ambition. Generals spoke in measured tones, aware that every suggestion carried the weight of lives and the pulse of armies. Some leaned toward caution, weighing exhaustion and terrain, while others urged speed, insisting that momentum could not be surrendered. Maps and models were traced, erased, and redrawn with gentle hands, marking the slow rhythm of contemplation. Soldiers outside followed shifts in orders with quiet attention, each step a reflection of the strategy being debated miles above. Horses paused at wells and streams, wagons rolled steadily, and the landscape held every movement softly in its embrace. Dust settled slowly over fields and roads, muted by the late afternoon sun, leaving subtle traces of progress and observation. Even the wind seemed attentive, rustling leaves and bending grasses, as if listening to the deliberation above. Civilians scattered along the edges of the journey sensed the subtle weight of command, noting the changes in movement with quiet curiosity. And as hours passed, the tension remained gentle yet persistent, shaping both mind and terrain. The slow rhythm of debate threaded itself through every mile, every thought, and every step of soldiers moving below. Meanwhile, small Soviet patrols continued their quiet observations, threading subtle lessons into every movement. They studied the paths of German columns, the rhythms of horses and wagons, and the habits of soldiers moving along dusty roads. Streams, forests, and fields offered both respite and instruction, shaping their understanding of timing and terrain. Dust rose gently beneath their feet, mingling with the scent of earth and grass, marking the rhythm of each cautious advance. Officers whispered guidance, soldiers followed attentively, and each moment became a soft lesson in adaptation and persistence. Even the wind carried a gentle insistence, rustling through leaves and grasses, threading encouragement into every careful step. Civilians watched, whispered, and sometimes followed, absorbing the subtle patterns of movement that hinted at broader strategies. And in these quiet actions, a sense of the larger war began to emerge, each small observation adding to the tapestry of knowledge. The rhythm of learning and debate, above and below, moved together with gentle insistence. Each step, each whispered suggestion, each measured motion carried the quiet pulse of rising anticipation forward. By evening, the discussions above and the movements below began to resonate together, threading strategy with observation, personality with consequence. Dust settled over roads, fields, and forests, a soft veil marking the passage of reflective hours. Soldiers paused in shadowed groves, horses nibbled quietly at grass, and wagons rested, all guided by careful intent. Generals continued their debate in subdued tones, aware of the delicate balance between momentum and caution. Streams shimmered softly in the waning light, reflecting the rhythm of day into rivers and ponds. Civilians tucked themselves into village edges, observing the pulse of decision and movement without interference. Even the wind seemed to carry patience, brushing along paths, trees, and fields with gentle insistence. Each step taken, each pause observed, and each quiet word shared threaded human presence into the rhythm of land and campaign alike. And as night approached, the tension remained, gentle but persistent, a quiet preparation for the days ahead. Strategy and personality intertwined subtly, carrying the promise of movement, resistance, and reflection forward into the unfolding story. The decision to shift the campaign southward carried with it a subtle gravity, a pause in the relentless march toward Moscow. Hitler's choice seemed abrupt yet deliberate, as if the city of Smolensk had whispered a warning through the land itself. Soldiers and officers, both German and Soviet, felt the change in rhythm, a soft easing of pressure that allowed reflection amid exhaustion. Dust settled along roads and forest paths, thickening in the late summer sun, marking time in quiet layers. Rivers reflected the muted light, their surfaces calm despite the turbulence of strategy and movement surrounding them. Fields stretched into distance, interspersed with forests that seemed to hold their breath, offering cover and respite to those moving beneath their shade. Civilians, weary yet vigilant, adjusted to the shifting flow of armies, noting the faint lull in intensity with cautious relief. Horses grazed, wagons creaked slowly over softened roads, and soldiers moved with careful attention to both land and orders. The city of Smolensk, battered and scarred, had endured, and in doing so had brought a fragile reprieve for Moscow. And in the quiet aftermath, the land itself seemed to sigh, carrying with it the weight of lives, choices, and waiting. As the German army turned its focus southward, small movements across the fields revealed the subtle aftermath of delay. Soldiers adjusted to the new rhythm, their pace less urgent, guided by measured caution rather than necessity. Dust curled softly along roads, mingling with the scent of warm earth, grass, and distant smoke. Streams and wells offered quiet refreshment to men and animals alike, their waters reflecting the subdued light of a late summer afternoon. Horses moved steadily, wagons rolled deliberately, and the air seemed to carry the quiet weight of both exhaustion and anticipation. Villages along the route became temporary havens, offering shade, water, and brief respite from the intensity of the campaign. Even forests seemed to participate in the rhythm, their leaves rustling softly, as if acknowledging the temporary pause. Civilians observed the changes in movement with careful attention, threading patience through their routines of survival. And through it all, the land bore witness to the shifting strategy, a silent partner in the quiet recalibration of plans. The southward turn had altered the tempo, allowing reflection amid the rhythm of endurance. Soviet commanders, sensing the diversion, adjusted their own strategies with subtle care. Scouts reported movement, careful to note the slower pace and new direction of German forces. Soldiers advanced cautiously, exploring the edges of control while maintaining measured formations. Dust rose in gentle clouds, brushed by wind that carried faint aromas of pine, soil, and distant smoke. Horses grazed and rested, wagons creaked along uneven paths, and the rhythm of movement threaded persistence through every mile. Streams provided cool refreshment, shadows softened the light, and every step offered lessons in patience and adaptability. Civilians along the routes observed quietly, noting the changes without understanding their full strategic weight. And as day gave way to evening, the quiet movements of both armies settled into a softer rhythm. The pause in the drive toward Moscow was tangible, a fragile gift wrought from cost and endurance. Smolensk's shadow lingered in every measured step, reminding all who moved of the price paid for delay. In German headquarters, the shift southward brought a mixture of relief and renewed calculation. Officers traced possible paths, their fingers lingering over rivers, forests, and fields that would shape the next stage of the campaign. Maps were consulted again and again, dust settling gently over tables and charts, recording the slow passage of thoughtful hours. Soldiers in the field felt the tempo ease, adjusting steps, pace, and focus to the softer rhythm of command. Horses nibbled quietly at grass, wagons rolled with careful creak, and streams offered brief moments of refreshment. The sun stretched low over the fields, softening shadows and illuminating dust in golden layers. Conversations were subdued, each word measured for consequence and clarity, threading strategy with reflection. Civilians observed cautiously, noting the slower pace, sensing the faint relief that accompanied temporary absence of immediate threat. And as night approached, the land itself seemed to absorb the quiet, carrying the memory of pause and endurance beneath a softening sky. Decisions made in distant rooms had ripples that moved gently across fields, forests, and rivers alike. The roads between Smolensk and the southern front became passages of quiet observation and adjustment. Soldiers moved with deliberate care, threading awareness into every step along dusty paths. Horses rested and grazed, wagons creaked under measured loads, and streams offered both refreshment and subtle instruction. Dust hung lightly in the warm air, settling softly over clothing, uniforms, and boots, marking the gentle passage of time. Trees swayed in the late afternoon breeze, their leaves whispering in cadence with the rhythm of movement. Civilians emerged cautiously from villages, noting the soft change in tempo and the lessening of immediate pressure. Even the wind seemed to carry patience, brushing gently across fields and riverbanks, threading encouragement through every mile. Small acts of movement, observation, and care created a rhythm that was both persistent and reflective. And as evening settled, the southward turn became a quiet teacher, illustrating the fragile interplay of strategy, time, and endurance. The pause allowed all who moved to breathe softly, carrying both relief and vigilance in measured steps. In the forests and fields beyond Smolensk, the echoes of previous battles lingered like soft shadows. Streams reflected fading light, carrying whispers of movement and patience along their slow paths. Soldiers moved carefully through undergrowth and uneven terrain, their attention split between orders and observation. Horses stepped steadily, wagons creaked with slow rhythm, and dust rose in gentle clouds that carried the scent of earth and pine. Civilians watched from the edges, threading quiet concern and cautious hope into the rhythm of their days. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, rustling leaves and brushing over fields with measured persistence. Small moments of rest allowed reflection, and each minor movement carried subtle lessons about endurance and timing. And through it all, the landscape itself seemed to carry memory, absorbing the consequences of delay and the slow unfolding of strategy. Smolensk had endured, and its shadow stretched into every step, every pause, and every breath. The southward diversion, though costly, offered fragile space for thought and resilience. Soldiers and officers alike began to adjust to the gentler tempo of movement. Columns of men, wagons, and horses moved steadily, threading careful paths through fields, forests, and along rivers. Dust settled softly on clothing, boots, and wheels, marking time in thin, persistent layers. Streams offered refreshment. Shade softened the heat of the late afternoon, and wind rustled leaves in soft cadence with steps. Civilians emerged slowly, noting the rhythm of movement and the subtle easing of tension along the roads. Every step carried memory, observation, and quiet calculation, threading lessons into the fabric of the campaign. Horses nibbled at grasses along paths, wagons creaked with patient load, and soldiers adjusted formation with gentle deliberation. And as dusk approached, the landscape seemed to absorb the subtle weight of strategy, endurance, and reflection. Smolensk's shadow lingered, a reminder of cost, delay, and the quiet influence of persistence. Time itself seemed to breathe softly along these roads, threading patience into every measured mile. By nightfall, the southern diversion had settled into a gentle, reflective rhythm. Soldiers rested in soft clusters, horses and wagons aligned with care, and streams shimmered quietly under fading light. Dust settled over fields, roads, and forest edges, marking both passage and patience. Officers in headquarters continued to measure possibilities, threading strategy with the knowledge that delay could carry consequences both subtle and profound. Civilians observed quietly, threading careful movements into villages and pathways, aware of both relief and the lingering shadow of what had passed. Trees swayed gently, rustling in soft rhythm with the quiet pulse of movement and reflection. Every step, pause, and whispered word reinforced the gentle rhythm of endurance, threading through both land and mind. And as night deepened, the campaigns above and below moved in measured time, carrying both memory and fragile hope forward. Smolensk, battered yet unbroken, remained a sentinel of persistence and patience, and in the stillness the land itself seemed to breathe with the quiet assurance of endurance, holding the history of delay in its gentle embrace. The streets of Smolensk had grown quieter, as if the city itself had learnt to move in measured, careful rhythms. Windows, half-shuttered, reflected a muted light across cobblestones dusted with fine layers of earth. Children's laughter was rare and soft, threading through alleys with tentative caution. Women carried small baskets along narrow paths, pausing at wells or patches of shade to rest and observe. The scent of bread mingled faintly with smoke from hearths, an understated reminder of persistence amid uncertainty. Horses and carts moved slowly, careful not to draw unnecessary attention, carrying goods from one edge of the city to another. Conversations were hushed, often framed by glances toward distant patrols or fleeting shadows along the roads. Even the wind seemed tempered, rustling leaves and loose papers in a soft, deliberate rhythm. Each step along these streets carried quiet negotiation, a balance between survival and small gestures of normalcy. And through it all, the city endured, threading life gently through the shadow of occupation. Families adjusted to routines shaped by scarcity and caution, finding rhythm in repetition. Water was carried carefully from wells, firewood stacked in measured piles, and meals portioned with awareness. Dust rose from narrow alleys as people moved quietly, a muted cloud marking daily labor. Children lingered at the edges of activity, observing, learning, and waiting with gentle patience. The scent of earth and smoke mingled with the warmth of sun on stone, softening the hardness of survival. Windows framed quiet interiors, where small fires burned for warmth and cooking, illuminating faces worn yet attentive. Even the streets seemed to bend to the rhythm of life, offering narrow paths of movement and observation. Conversation was measured, whispers threaded between glances, and small acts of care persisted amid unease. The city's heartbeat continued in gentle pulses, carrying history, hope, and endurance quietly forward. And as evening approached, shadows stretched across roads and rooftops, wrapping Smolensk in a calm, reflective hush. Markets operated in hushed tones, traders balancing scarcity with subtle ingenuity. Baskets of vegetables, small loaves of bread, and barrels of preserved goods moved slowly across tables and carts. Dust curled along the edges of streets, catching the last light of day in muted glimmers. Women exchanged small words and gestures, passing news, advice, and reassurance with quiet insistence. Children moved between their parents' feet, learning to navigate the subtle rhythm of survival in a city that had become cautious. Horses rested at the edges of the square, nibbling gently at straw, while wagons creaked with measured motion. The scent of bread, smoke, and earth carried softly through narrow lanes, threading a sense of continuity into daily life. Even in silence, the city seemed attentive, its walls and streets absorbing the soft pulse of endurance. Civilians balanced fear with necessity, threading patience and subtle vigilance into every action. And through these small repeated movements, Smolensk quietly maintained the essence of life beneath the weight of occupation. Houses, though scarred and marked by previous conflict, became sanctuaries of quiet reflection. Firelight flickered across wooden floors and simple furnishings, casting shadows that moved with slow deliberation. Dust from movement and wind settled lightly across every surface, forming a gentle memory of passage. Children listened to whispered stories from elders, voices soft but firm threading history and caution together. Women mended clothing, prepared modest meals, and tended to the youngest with careful attention. Even the wind carried a gentle insistence, brushing through trees and alleys, threading rhythm into the city's quiet pulse. Conversations outside were clipped, measured, yet carried subtle warmth between neighbors and friends. Horses and carts moved along familiar paths, creaking softly, their rhythm unhurried and attentive. Civilians moved within these spaces with care, observing, adapting, and enduring in quiet solidarity. And through each careful step and whispered word, the city's heartbeat persisted, resilient and unbroken beneath the shadows of control. Resistance, though quiet and measured, threaded through the city like a hidden river. Notes passed discreetly, whispers exchanged in corners, small acts of defiance woven into the texture of everyday life. Dust rose softly as couriers moved, careful to tread lightly through alleys and along paths. The rhythm of horses and wagons continued, punctuated by the subtle movements of those who navigated the city cautiously. Windows reflected the muted light of late afternoon, illuminating fleeting gestures of care, support, and vigilance. Civilians observed, learned, and adapted, threading patience through every interaction and every step. Children watched closely, absorbing lessons in subtlety, awareness, and resilience. The scent of bread, smoke, and earth mingled softly, marking the gentle persistence of ordinary routines. Even the trees seemed to sway in time with the city, brushing leaves in soft cadence with human movement. And in every quiet act of endurance, Smolensk preserved a delicate, persistent pulse of life beneath occupation's shadow. Evenings brought a reflective calm, streets softened by the fading light and whisper of wind. Candles glimmered in windows, providing warmth and quiet illumination without attracting undue attention. Horses rested along edges of roads, wagons halted, and dust settled in delicate layers over cobblestones and soil. Families gathered indoors, sharing meals that were small but thoughtfully prepared, threading sustenance with connection. Children listened intently, absorbing the rhythm of observation, caution, and subtle guidance. Conversations were quiet, punctuated by laughter or gentle reassurance, forming small arcs of hope amid uncertainty. The city itself seemed to breathe softly, walls and trees absorbing the rhythm of measured life. Civilians navigated alleys and courtyards with careful attention, threading small gestures of care into daily routines. Even the night air carried a soft insistence, brushing rooftops and leaves with gentle persistence. And as darkness settled fully, Smolensk endured, a quiet testament to the resilience of life, threaded softly through shadow and dust. In the edges of the city, gardens and fields offered subtle sustenance and quiet rhythm. Vegetables grew slowly, carefully tended, their green leaves brushing softly against wooden fences. Water flowed gently from wells, filling containers with muted sound, threading life through the mundane acts of survival. Dust settled on tools, baskets, and clothing, marking the passage of days in gentle layers. Children moved quietly, observing, learning, and threading attention into each movement. Horses and carts continued along softened paths, their creaks and steps echoing with unhurried rhythm. Conversations were clipped but warm, careful gestures shared between neighbors and friends. The smell of earth, smoke, and cooking carried softly through the alleys, mingling with sunlight on stone and soil. Even the wind seemed measured, rustling leaves, brushing dust, and threading the city's pulse in gentle cadence. And through all these small deliberate actions, Smolensk endured, carrying life forward softly, quietly, and persistently. By night, the city settled into a gentle, persistent rhythm of endurance. Horses breathed slowly, wagons rested along quiet roads, and dust lay softly across streets and paths. Windows glimmered with small fires, illuminating faces marked by care, attention, and resilience. Families gathered indoors, threading conversation, nourishment, and warmth into the fabric of the evening. The wind brushed gently through trees, along rooftops, and across cobblestones, carrying whispers of life forward. Children slept lightly, dreams threaded with the quiet rhythm of observation and gentle instruction. Even the city itself seemed to exhale, its walls and streets absorbing the soft insistence of continued life. Civilians navigated the nuances of survival with careful attention, threading patience, vigilance, and subtle resistance into every action. And in the calm of night, Smolensk's heartbeat persisted, gentle yet undeniable, carrying the promise of endurance quietly forward. Life continued, small yet unbroken, softly threaded through the shadows of occupation and the pulse of the enduring city. In the forests surrounding Smolensk, shadows moved with gentle purpose, threaded through with careful vigilance. Small groups gathered quietly beneath thick canopies, listening to the wind rustle through leaves and learning to measure their steps by the rhythm of the land. The scent of damp earth and pine mingled with faint smoke from hidden fires, marking the presence of activity unseen. Words were whispered in careful cadence, names exchanged in trust, plans formed slowly and deliberately. Horses and wagons passed along distant roads, unaware of the subtle pulse growing in the woods. Civilians, scattered at the edges of villages, carried news discreetly, threading small gestures of support into everyday routines. Even the rivers seemed to reflect patience, their waters moving slowly but insistently, echoing the quiet persistence of these nascent movements. Every step, every pause, and every careful observation added to the quiet accumulation of knowledge and intent. The forests themselves seemed to hold these secrets softly, carrying whispers of defiance across the hills and streams. And in this still, deliberate rhythm, the first seeds of resistance were quietly sown, preparing to ripple outward. Partisan groups learned the subtle art of movement, threading through forests and fields with careful attention. Dust rose faintly along hidden paths, disturbed only by small deliberate steps that left no trace for those who might follow. Water from streams provided refreshment, reflecting the muted light of morning as if preserving the calm of the day. Horses moved silently, wagons were avoided, and supplies were carried in quiet bundles along overgrown trails. Messages passed by couriers traveled through villages in hushed whispers, threading the pulse of defiance into everyday life. The air carried the scents of earth, wood, and smoke, gentle reminders of labor, endurance, and subtle coordination. Civilians observed the rhythm from safe distances, nodding to messengers or leaving small offerings of food or advice. Even the wind seemed to bend with discretion, rustling leaves without betraying the careful movements beneath. Each quiet act strengthened the bonds of trust and the fabric of resistance, threading persistence into the landscape. And as night approached, the forest itself seemed to breathe with the anticipation of change, a gentle tension ready to unfold. The sabotage of railways began slowly, measured, and deliberate, as partisans traced the lines with quiet precision. Tools were carried lightly, movements deliberate, and footsteps careful to avoid detection. Dust rose softly in the still air, brushed by the wind carrying scents of pine, soil, and distant smoke. Nights became a quiet theatre of activity, small teams threading along tracks with silent intent, leaving only the faintest traces behind. Civilians watched from hidden edges, offering subtle guidance and encouragement without intrusion. Streams reflected the soft glow of moonlight, casting silver along paths that twisted gently through forests. Horses grazed in distant fields, their quiet movements a muted counterpoint to human planning. Each successful disruption carried both a practical effect and a symbolic weight, threading hope and persistence through occupied lands. The forests, rivers, and fields absorbed every deliberate action, as if preserving the memory of quiet resistance. And in this gentle accumulation of effort, the whisper of defiance began to grow, unseen yet unmistakable. Training and preparation became a slow, rhythmic pulse, measured by observation, endurance, and trust. Partisans learned to read the land, to follow streams, trace paths, and move in alignment with the natural contours of hills and forests. Dust settled lightly along trails and clearings, marking passage without drawing attention. Conversations were whispered, instructions shared carefully, and every movement carried a dual purpose of learning and survival. Horses and wagons remained distant, avoided when possible, while small bundles of supplies traveled in quiet hands. Civilians continued to thread support subtly, leaving nourishment, messages, or guidance in the soft rhythm of daily life. The scent of earth, pine, and faint smoke carried across hidden camps, mingling with anticipation and focus. Each action, no matter how minor, contributed to the growing cohesion of resistance. And as dusk softened the light, the forest seemed to hold its breath, cradling the nascent energy of quiet defiance. The seeds planted in these careful moments promised a slow, persistent growth beneath the shadowed canopy. Observation of German movements continued with attentive care, measured by patience and insight. Soldiers on patrols followed predictable routes, their routines threading through the landscape with muted cadence. Partisans traced these paths quietly, learning patterns, recording subtle shifts, and threading knowledge into plans without detection. Dust rose softly beneath deliberate footsteps, mingling with the scent of earth, leaves, and smoke. Water from streams offered quiet refreshment, mirrored by the reflection of trees and the soft light of the afternoon sun. Civilians passed messages in hushed tones, threading the pulse of resistance into everyday routines without attracting notice. Even the wind seemed attentive, rustling leaves in gentle rhythm, carrying the subtle memory of careful movement. Each small success, every hidden observation, and every whispered exchange strengthened the growing network of defiance. Horses grazed quietly, wagons moved slowly on distant roads, and the landscape absorbed the quiet pulse of planning. And through this measured rhythm, the partisans prepared themselves for the next phase, threading persistence into the heart of the occupied lands. As night deepened, the forests became a sanctuary for reflection and subtle coordination. Fires burned low, casting soft warmth and shadows across faces attentive to instruction and planning. Dust settled lightly on clothing and ground, preserving the memory of movement while leaving no trace for unintended eyes. Trees swayed softly, their branches rustling in time with whispered words, creating a natural rhythm to accompany careful discussion. Streams reflected moonlight, providing a quiet backdrop to thought, conversation, and quiet laughter shared between those learning to trust one another. Civilians continued their discreet support, threading small acts of aid into the night with gentle attention. Each step, each whispered plan, and each measured action reinforced the pulse of persistence threading through the landscape. Horses rested nearby, wagons were drawn back along hidden paths, and the rhythm of life and survival intertwined in quiet harmony. And as darkness deepened, the seeds of resistance took root, threading patience, vigilance, and hope through every corner of the forest. The night held these nascent efforts softly, a gentle guardian of whispered defiance and persistent endurance. Communication between hidden groups flowed like a river of careful observation. Messages passed slowly, coded or whispered, threading intelligence and guidance into networks that stretched across fields, forests, and villages. Dust settled along secret paths, marking steps without exposing the intent behind them. Rivers and streams carried both sound and reflection, murmuring quietly as if reinforcing the rhythm of patience. Civilians supported these efforts with subtle gestures, leaving nourishment or directions in ways that could pass unnoticed. The scent of pine, earth, and low fires mingled in soft harmony with the rhythm of movement. Partisans practiced restraint and observation, learning to thread subtlety into every action and every step. Horses and wagons moved only when necessary, always in alignment with the pulse of careful timing. And through these soft threads of coordination, the force of quiet defiance grew, imperceptible yet undeniable, threading hope into the occupied land. Every measured motion carried the promise of persistence, softly preparing the landscape for what was yet to come. By dawn, the forests carried a quiet energy, a rhythm of vigilance and preparation that threaded through every hidden path. Morning light reflected softly across streams, illuminating trails that had been traced and retraced with gentle care. Partisans moved with deliberate steps, attentive to every sound, shadow, and movement in the still air. Dust rose faintly, mingling with the scent of earth, pine, and faint smoke, marking the slow passage of time. Horses grazed quietly at forest edges, wagons remained distant, and the rhythm of careful preparation continued unbroken. Civilians offered subtle support, threading small acts of courage into everyday life with gentle attention. Every observation, every whispered plan, and every careful movement strengthened the network of persistence quietly taking shape. The land seemed to hold its breath, absorbing the deliberate pulse of resistance, like soft memory. And as the day unfolded, the seeds planted in shadowed forests began to stretch toward growth, a gentle but persistent force threading through the rhythm of occupied Smolensk. These quiet efforts promised that even under watchful eyes, hope could move softly, steadily, and enduringly forward. Across the fields and forests of Smolensk, the earth bore quiet testimony to lives lost and memories folded into soil. Grasses swayed gently over uneven ground, hiding contours that whispered of histories carried softly beneath. The scent of damp earth mingled with faint traces of smoke and wood, a reminder of past days when the land had been alive with movement and purpose. Trees stretched their branches overhead, brushing leaves together as if murmuring soft condolences. Paths wound carefully through fields, tracing the passage of those who remained, threading between spaces where the fallen rested in silent repose. Even rivers seemed to reflect the hush of loss, their waters moving gently as if carrying memories along with them. Birds called softly from distant trees, their notes echoing faintly across quiet expanses, threading sound through stillness. Small villages observed the passage of seasons, roofs and chimneys marking time in delicate, persistent rhythms. And in every gentle breeze, every soft rustle of leaves, the land seemed to breathe quietly for those no longer able to walk its paths. Smolensk itself became an unmarked cemetery, holding its losses in patient remembrance. Among forests, shadows deepened over moss and soil, marking places where soldiers and civilians had disappeared into history's soft folds. Paths curved around knolls and hollows, lined with grasses and wildflowers that hid subtle depressions in the earth. Dust rose lightly with wind, carrying faint whispers of memory and reflection. Streams flowed calmly through valleys, their waters threading between trees, brushing over stones worn smooth by years of passage. Birds flitted quietly through branches, pausing to survey open fields where the land held its silence. Houses at the edges of forests stood still, roofs dusted with leaves, windows reflecting soft sunlight and quiet attentiveness. Each step across fields felt measured, threaded with awareness of lives absorbed into earth, threading history through the pulse of land. The scent of pine, earth, and faint smoke mingled in the air, carrying both remembrance and gentle melancholy. Even shadows seemed attentive, stretching softly across paths, trees, and fields as though acknowledging absence. And in the stillness, the land itself whispered of patience, endurance, and quiet reverence. Cemeteries formed naturally, in hidden clearings, unmarked and tended only by memory and wind. Grass bent with the movement of light, soft underfoot and resilient in quiet persistence. Dust settled gently across the contours of land, layering remembrance with subtle care. The air carried the faint scent of earth and vegetation, mingling with echoes of past lives threaded through memory. Birds called across distances, their sounds threading reflection into stillness. Streams and rivulets moved quietly, brushing over stones and fallen leaves, carrying continuity through the landscape. Trees shaded hollows and knolls, their branches whispering with gentle insistence, marking spaces of absence with quiet dignity. Villages nearby observed seasons with careful rhythm, roofs and chimneys marking time while lives unfolded slowly. Every measured movement across the land threaded consciousness with memory, connecting present awareness to absence with delicate subtlety. And as light softened, the landscape seemed to hold all loss softly, quietly, and patiently. Soldiers who had passed left faint traces across forests and fields, recorded only in subtle shifts of earth and grass. Paths curved around gentle slopes, moss clinging where footsteps had once pressed. Dust and pollen rose lightly in air, stirred by wind, carrying quiet reminders of passage and presence. Streams reflected the muted light of morning, threading soft glimmers across hidden clearings and gentle hills. Birds and small animals moved through underbrush, unaware of history carried beneath their feet, yet participating in the gentle pulse of life that persisted. Villagers observed quietly, threading daily routines with awareness of history, memory, and absence. Trees swayed softly in rhythm, with light and wind, brushing leaves together in whispered acknowledgement. Every step taken along these paths carried weight, measured in reflection, remembrance, and enduring presence. And through these quiet movements, Smolensk's fields and forests continued to hold memory, offering soft, unspoken solace to those who remained. The landscape itself became both witness and memorial, patient and enduring. Even roads and pathways bore the subtle imprint of lives that had passed, threaded quietly through forests and villages. Dust settled on cobblestones, mingling with fallen leaves, creating soft patterns that recorded history in gentle layers. Horses and wagons moved along distant roads, their steps threading sound into quiet air, echoing the rhythm of passage long past. Windows and rooftops reflected sunlight, illuminating the dust and the stillness with soft persistence. The scent of earth and faint smoke lingered, a quiet companion to movement and reflection. Birds circled overhead, calling softly, threading notes into the hush of trees and fields. Villagers paused along paths, aware of absence in subtle ways, threading care and observation through daily acts. Streams moved gently through valleys, carrying light and memory across stones and moss. Every measured step, every sound, and every observation threaded awareness into the landscape, keeping memory alive without words. And in this quiet, the land itself cradled the invisible graves, patient and enduring beneath sky and tree. Hollows and knolls became natural markers of memory, softened by moss and grass, hidden from casual view, yet persistent in presence. Dust rose softly as wind moved through fields, brushing gently over uneven earth. Streams meandered, carrying soft reflections of light, shadow, and subtle continuity. Trees stood with patient strength, brushing leaves together to thread whispers of remembrance through quiet air. Birds called from branches, their notes echoing through hollows and across mossed paths. Villagers tended small plots or paths with care, threading attention into spaces marked by absence. Horses and distant wagons moved slowly along hidden paths, carrying rhythm and sound without urgency. Each measured movement carried reflection, connecting the living to those absorbed quietly into soil. And in every subtle observation, the land seemed to remember, holding absence with soft persistence. Smolensk's forests and fields became a vast, silent record, threading loss and endurance together with gentle consistency. Morning light illuminated gentle depressions in fields, brushing softly over moss, grass, and fallen leaves. Streams reflected the sun's early warmth, moving quietly through hollows and low valleys. Dust settled on earth, threading memory with soft persistence across the land. Birds flitted between trees, their movement creating subtle rhythms that threaded through air, water, and soil. Villagers moved with quiet attentiveness, pausing to notice small shifts in the landscape, recognizing absence in nuanced ways. Horses grazed and wagons creaked in distant fields, echoing rhythm and continuity through the soft morning light. Trees bent slightly with gentle wind, brushing branches together in whispered acknowledgement of history and patience. Every measured step, every soft sound, and every careful observation carried reflection across the landscape. And as the day unfolded, the land held memory softly, threading absence, endurance, and quiet recognition through forests, fields, and rivers alike. Smolensk, vast and patient, remained a silent witness to lives folded gently into earth. By evening, the hush of the land deepened, carrying reflection through forests, fields, and gentle hills. Shadows stretched softly across paths and knolls, blending dust, grass, and moss into patterns of quiet memory. Streams reflected the fading light, threading continuity across space and time. Birds called faintly from treetops, threading sound through stillness and shadow. Villagers moved slowly, threading awareness of absence and persistence through daily routines. Horses rested quietly, wagons halted in soft alignment with paths, and the rhythm of movement became measured, attentive, reflective. Trees bent slightly in evening wind, brushing leaves together like whispers, echoing the quiet persistence of memory. Every step, pause, and breath threaded the present with the absence of those folded into soil. And in the hush of nightfall, Smolensk itself seemed to exhale softly, carrying all loss with patient, enduring calm. The land cradled its forgotten graves, threading remembrance gently into every hill, forest, and field, a quiet testament to persistence beneath sky and wind. The road stretching from Smolensk toward Moscow unfolded like a ribbon of muted anticipation, threading through forests, fields, and quiet villages. Dust rose softly along tracks worn by wagons and distant horses, disturbed only by the measured passage of troops. The air carried scents of earth and pine, mingled faintly with smoke from distant fires, a gentle reminder of persistence and movement. Soldiers moved with quiet attention, aware of both the urgency ahead and the subtle delays accumulated behind them. Streams traced the contours of the land, reflecting muted light across rocks and moss, their waters threading a rhythm through the quiet of travel. Villagers observed from edges of fields, noting movement without interruption, threading calm awareness into everyday routines. Trees brushed leaves together softly, as if murmuring in the gentle rhythm of the march, acknowledging the tension of progress. Every measured step, every pause for observation, threaded the landscape with the subtle pulse of time gained and lost. And as days stretched forward, the long road to Moscow carried with it the quiet weight of consequence and preparation. Smolensk's delay lingered in memory, shaping the journey with unseen persistence. Forests thickened along the route, offering both cover and constraint, guiding the pace of march with subtle insistence. Dust settled lightly across undergrowth and winding paths, marking the passage of men and horses with faint persistence. The scent of pine mingled with moist earth, creating a quiet undercurrent of reflection and continuity. Soldiers threaded movement carefully, balancing urgency with caution, aware that every step shaped what lay ahead. Villages remained still, roofs and chimneys glinting faintly in the soft light, offering subtle markers of human life continuing amid the march. Streams and small rivers whispered softly, threading continuity through terrain that resisted hasty passage. The rhythm of horses and wagons mingled with soft winds, brushing leaves and dust into patterns of patient persistence. Every step along the road carried both anticipation and consequence, threading strategic awareness into the physical landscape. And through these measured movements, the weight of history pressed gently, reminding all who traveled that Smolensk's time had reshaped the path forward. The land itself seemed to absorb these quiet lessons, holding memory and consequence in gentle balance. Supply lines stretched thin, threading necessity through the rhythm of distant forests and open plains. Dust rose lightly along roads where wagons creaked and horses shifted, carrying stores meant to sustain movement across the growing distance. Rivers and streams provided quiet markers of passage, threading the land with soft reflection. Soldiers adjusted pace and formation with subtle awareness, balancing urgency with measured attention. The scent of earth, smoke, and pine carried faintly along each mile, reminding travelers of both continuity and disruption. Villagers continued daily routines, observing without intrusion, threading small gestures of endurance and care into the unfolding journey. Trees brushed leaves gently in the wind, echoing the quiet rhythm of deliberate travel. Every step, every pause for adjustment, threaded both history and strategy into the landscape. And as the days lengthened, the long road ahead carried the subtle weight of consequences born in Smolensk, threading patience and persistence into every measured movement. The journey toward Moscow became a quiet testament to the unseen influence of time gained and lost. Encounters with rivers and hills shaped the pace, threading natural rhythm into the march toward Moscow. Streams reflected the muted light of early morning, threading continuity across mossed stones and low banks. Soldiers moved with soft, deliberate steps, balancing necessity with awareness of the long road ahead. Dust settled gently along edges of paths, disturbed only by careful passage. The scent of pine and earth mingled with faint smoke from distant fires, a quiet marker of human persistence. Villages offered intermittent signs of life, roofs and chimneys, reflecting soft sunlight, while inhabitants continued routines with calm attention. Horses and wagons creaked along roads, echoing measured rhythm through valleys and open fields. Trees swayed slightly, brushing leaves together in soft whispers, acknowledging passage and endurance. Each mile carried reflection, threading consequences of delay, resistance, and persistence into the landscape. And in this slow accumulation of movement, the road became both marker and memory, a gentle prelude to what awaited near Moscow. Weather began to temper the rhythm of movement. Cool mornings threading dew across dust and cobblestones. Mist lingered in low valleys, softening edges of trees, fields, and distant hills, carrying subtle reflection. Soldiers adjusted their pace, balancing urgency with caution, each step threading endurance through awareness. Streams whispered across stones, reflecting muted light, while birds flitted softly along forest edges, threading sound into stillness. Villagers observed quietly, threading gestures of care and survival into routines that flowed gently alongside the advancing march. Horses and wagons moved with measured attention, each creak and shuffle mingling with the rhythm of nature and human persistence. Dust rose lightly, settling on paths and vegetation, leaving a soft record of careful passage. Trees bent gently with wind, brushing leaves together in whispered cadence, echoing the quiet pulse of journey and consequence. Every mile threaded preparation into movement, patience into urgency, and reflection into the fabric of the road. And as the day matured, the long route to Moscow stretched forward with subtle insistence, carrying history, strategy, and endurance quietly together. Evening brought a muted hush. Roads softened under fading light, and streams reflected long shadows from distant trees. Soldiers adjusted positions for rest, threading awareness and caution into temporary pauses. Dust settled softly across fields, marking time and passage with gentle care. The scent of pine, earth, and smoke carried faintly across the quiet land, threading reflection through air and soil alike. Villagers moved slowly along edges of forests, carrying small gestures of sustenance or observation, threading continuity through daily life. Horses and wagons rested quietly, their rhythm absorbed into the soft pulse of wind and leaves. Trees swayed gently, brushing leaves together in muted cadence, echoing the slow, deliberate rhythm of movement. Each measured step, each pause, and each quiet observation threaded patience and endurance into the march. And as dusk deepened, the road stretched forward, softening urgency with reflection, carrying both consequence and preparation toward Moscow. The distance traveled became a gentle reminder that every moment gained or lost in Smolensk shaped the unfolding journey. Forest and field merged along the horizon, threading a seamless rhythm of movement toward the city ahead. Dust settled lightly along pathways, disturbed only by the careful step of soldier or scout. Streams and rivulets reflected the waning light, threading continuity through land that had absorbed months of motion and memory. Villagers observed silently, threading subtle gestures of care and attention into the quiet persistence of life. Horses grazed in distant fields, wagons creaked softly along roads, and every sound threaded rhythm into the still air. Trees brushed leaves together gently, echoing the soft cadence of human passage, carrying lessons of endurance and consequence. Each mile threaded patience, awareness, and reflection into the long, unfolding road. Soldiers moved with measured attention, mindful of both urgency and subtle delay, threading quiet determination into every step. And through this persistent rhythm, the journey toward Moscow carried weight and purpose, threaded softly with the consequences of Smolensk resistance. The road itself seemed to hold memory, patience, and quiet insistence, preparing all who traveled for what lay ahead. By nightfall, the land absorbed the passage of the day, trees swaying softly, streams whispering quietly across stones. Dust settled over roads, forests, and fields, threading a delicate record of movement and time. Soldiers paused for rest, threading patience and reflection into temporary pauses beneath soft moonlight. The scent of earth, pine, and distant smoke carried across valleys, threading subtle awareness through the quiet night. Villagers observed from edges of light and shadow, threading continuity into routines that endured beyond observation. Horses and wagons rested, their soft breathing echoing in rhythm with the night wind. Trees brushed leaves together in gentle cadence, carrying memory, passage, and quiet persistence across the landscape. Every step taken along the road to Moscow, every measured breath and pause, carried consequence and reflection forward with soft insistence. And as the night deepened, the journey continued in quiet, hypnotic rhythm, each mile threading Smolensk's lessons into the long, unfolding path ahead. The long road held patience, endurance, and soft inevitability, guiding the march gently yet inexorably toward Moscow. After the guns fell silent, Smolensk began its slow, patient recovery, the city breathing quietly through dust and rubble. Streets once broken were traced with careful hands, each stone laid a gentle affirmation of endurance and memory. Smoke from chimneys mingled with the scent of fresh earth, a soft reminder that life was returning at its own deliberate pace. Trees that had endured shells and fire now stretched branches into soft sunlight, brushing leaves together in quiet celebration. Villagers and returning survivors moved carefully through open squares and quiet lanes, threading past and present into small, mindful steps. Memorials rose gradually in parks, fields, and hilltops, their stone and metal holding memory like a silent guardian. Flowers were placed thoughtfully, petals brushing over inscriptions and soil with gentle care. Even rivers reflected the calm of renewal, waters threading past bridges and trees as if carrying stories from one season to the next. Every rebuilt home, every repaired road, and every quiet act of reconstruction carried persistence softly through the city. And through it all, Smolensk seemed to exhale slowly, holding memory and continuity in patient rhythm. Survivors walked the paths of forests and fields, where echoes of the past lingered like a soft fragrance. Footsteps pressed lightly against mossed earth, threading presence into spaces shaped by absence. The air carried scents of pine, earth, and lingering smoke, gentle reminders of both struggle and endurance. Streams moved slowly through valleys, reflecting sunlight and shadow in quiet, rhythmic pulses. Trees swayed slightly, brushing leaves together in whispers that seemed to acknowledge memory without intrusion. Villagers tended small plots, threading care into soil and gardens, connecting the pulse of life to the rhythm of remembrance. Dust settled over paths and roads, marking movement without erasing history, blending past and present seamlessly. Every soft sound, birdsong, flowing water, distant footfalls, threaded reflection into the hush of the landscape. And as survivors paused in gentle observation, Smolensk itself seemed to cradle their memories, patient and enduring. The city remembered without urgency, threading quiet understanding into every hill, grove, and square. Memorials took shape slowly, stones and inscriptions rising like soft whispers over open fields. Flowers and wreaths carried scent and color into quiet spaces, threading tribute through air and soil. Visitors moved carefully among monuments, their footsteps measured and attentive, threading reflection into every step. Trees brushed leaves overhead, their movement carrying subtle rhythms of acknowledgement and endurance. Streams and rivulets threaded past, reflecting sunlight and shadow while carrying distant murmurs along their paths. Villagers paused at edges, observing quietly, threading gentle presence into spaces shaped by absence. Dust settled lightly, blending with grass, stone, and pathways, preserving the soft record of passage. Birds called from distant branches, their songs threading the hush with melody and subtle vitality. Every moment spent among these memorials carried reflection, endurance, and gratitude softly across the landscape. And in the stillness, Smolensk itself seemed to gather remembrance, holding both loss and persistence in patient balance. Houses and streets bore subtle traces of history, restored with attention to memory and survival. Roofs gleamed faintly in sunlight, windows reflecting soft movement within rooms filled with life. The scent of fresh earth, wood, and faint smoke threaded through air, a reminder of reconstruction and quiet care. People moved with mindful rhythm, threading daily routines through streets that had endured fire, dust, and shadow. Trees shaded squares and pathways, brushing leaves together as if in soft conversation with the past. Streams traced old courses, carrying water gently across stones and soil, reflecting both sunlight and memory. Dust settled on rooftops, paths, and gardens, preserving subtle layers of continuity and reflection. Children played quietly along avenues, their laughter threading life into spaces once shaped by absence and tension. Every measured step, glance, and gesture carried the soft weight of survival forward. And through it all, Smolensk exhaled a patient calm, a city quietly remembering, threading past and present in gentle balance. Fields beyond the city remained quiet, threaded with stories of both soldiers and civilians. Grass swayed in gentle rhythm, brushing over subtle depressions that hinted at buried memory. The air carried scents of earth, flowers, and distant smoke, soft traces of history lingering in quiet folds. Trees rose along borders and slopes, brushing leaves in gentle motion, threading calm acknowledgement into the landscape. Villagers passed slowly through lanes and paths, threading observation and presence into spaces shaped by endurance. Streams reflected light softly, tracing contours of valleys while carrying memory across earth and stone. Dust rose faintly with each careful step, settling gently to mark passage without erasing memory. Birds flitted among branches, their calls threading melody through hush and shadow. Every subtle movement, sound, and observation carried reflection, connecting the present with the past. And as twilight deepened, Smolensk held quiet vigil over both life and memory, patient and enduring. Evenings carried a gentle hush, windows glowing with warm light while streets absorbed the rhythm of soft movement. Roofs and chimneys reflected fading sunlight, carrying subtle warmth into quiet squares and alleys. Trees swayed gently in evening wind, brushing leaves together in whispered rhythm. Streams and ponds mirrored the muted sky, threading calm reflection across water and stone. Villagers moved with slow awareness, threading continuity and care through spaces once marred by absence. Dust settled softly on roads and gardens, preserving subtle records of presence and passage. Children's laughter mingled with bird calls and wind, threading gentle vitality into the calm landscape. Each careful step, gesture, and observation carried remembrance forward, softening the edges of loss. And through the quiet streets and fields, Smolensk exhaled slowly, threading memory, endurance, and life into a patient, rhythmic whole. The city whispered its history gently, a quiet testament to survival, reflection, and care. Monuments and quiet parks became places of meditation, threads of remembrance woven softly through grass and stone. Flowers, wreaths, and small offerings carried scent and color, threading acknowledgement into the hush. Visitors moved attentively, threading steps, glances, and soft words into memory. Trees brushed leaves together in gentle rhythm, echoing endurance across the quiet landscape. Streams reflected muted sunlight, tracing continuity along soft bends and mossed banks. Dust settled lightly on pathways, preserving traces of gentle passage without interruption. Birds sang quietly among branches, threading melody into silence and shadow. Every thoughtful gesture, reflection, and pause carried remembrance forward with subtle insistence. And as evening deepened, Smolensk cradled memory in patient rhythm, threading past, present, and quiet persistence across fields, streets, and rivers. The city remembered softly, enduringly, like a slow, deep exhale of history. Nightfall gathered softly over Smolensk, the city and surrounding fields wrapped in quiet stillness. Roofs glimmered faintly beneath moonlight, Trees swayed gently, and rivers reflected soft silvery threads of sky. Dust settled across streets and paths, preserving traces of movement, thought, and reflection. Streams whispered gently across stones, threading continuity through earth and memory. Birds had hushed, leaving only faint rustle of leaves and gentle sighs of wind to carry sound. Villagers rested in quiet homes, threading calm presence into rooms that had endured fire, dust, and shadow. Monuments stood softly under stars, carrying memory, endurance, and gratitude across time. Every observation, gesture, and step threaded remembrance into the patient rhythm of night. And as Smolensk slept beneath gentle sky, the city held its history, memories, and survivors with quiet insistence. In the hush of night, past and present wove together softly, and the city exhaled a calm, enduring breath of remembrance. Smolensk rests quietly now, a city threaded with history, memory, and gentle endurance. Its streets, rebuilt and softened by time, carry whispers of past footsteps, threading present life with echoes of absence. Trees sway softly in the wind, brushing leaves together as if murmuring stories long held in patient memory. Rivers move gently through the landscape, threading continuity across fields, forests, and bridges. Every cobblestone, path, and garden holds a subtle pulse of remembrance, the soft rhythm of life woven through absence. Villagers move calmly along streets and alleys, threading continuity and care into everyday routines, mindful of history's quiet presence. Dust settles lightly across roofs and paths, recording passage without hurry, preserving soft traces of memory. And through it all, Smolensk seems to breathe slowly, threading past, present, and endurance into every corner of its being. The city is a gateway, a pause in the sweep of history, carrying both story and silence. It holds memory gently, as if time itself has softened around its edges. The forests surrounding the city hum with quiet life, their leaves brushing together in soft, persistent rhythm. Paths wind carefully through moss and fallen leaves, threading shadows with sunlight in gentle patterns. Streams ripple slowly across stones, carrying water and reflection, echoing the patient passage of time. Birds call softly in the distance, their notes weaving through branches and air, threading sound into stillness. Villagers observe subtle shifts in light and wind, threading attention into the hush that blankets fields and roads. Stones and monuments rise quietly from earth, holding memory like a patient sentinel, threaded with flowers, inscription, and quiet care. Dust drifts along paths, settling lightly to preserve the gentle rhythm of footsteps and thought. Every measured step, pause, and glance threads awareness of history through the present. And in this soft communion of land, memory, and life, Smolensk carries its stories forward without urgency or insistence. The city is patient, enduring, and profoundly attentive to the passage of time. Even in empty fields, the echoes of past struggles persist, subtle as whispers of wind across grass and soil. Gentle slopes and hidden hollows mark places of memory, threaded by the soft rhythm of seasons. Trees brush leaves together overhead, their movement creating a hushed cadence of acknowledgement. Streams trace meandering paths, reflecting light and shadow in quiet continuity. Dust rises lightly as small animals move along hidden trails, threading life into spaces shaped by both absence and endurance. Villagers pass slowly along distant roads, threading reflection, observation, and care into each measured step. Every stone, leaf, and blade of grass seems to hold attention, as if aware of past and present intertwined. Birds flit gently between branches, threading subtle notes into the quiet pulse of the land. And across every field, forest, and road, Smolensk breathes softly, threading memory, loss, and resilience into a single, gentle rhythm. The city, the land, and its people carry history quietly, like a slow, enduring exhale. Memorials rise with deliberate calm, their stone and metal soft in presence yet insistent in remembrance. Flowers, wreaths, and small offerings thread scent, color, and care into stillness. Visitors walk slowly, threading reflection and gratitude through the hush of space and time. Trees sway gently above paths, brushing leaves together in whispered rhythm, threading acknowledgement into the quiet. Streams ripple across mossed banks, carrying light and memory along gentle courses. Dust settles over stone, earth, and grass, preserving the quiet rhythm of measured passage. Every step, pause, and thoughtful glance carries remembrance softly forward, threading reflection into stillness. Birds call faintly, threading notes into air and shadow, echoing persistence across space. And through these soft gestures, Smolensk becomes both witness and keeper, threading past, present, and enduring silence together. The city whispers its story quietly, carrying lessons of patience, resilience, and calm observance. Rivers, hills, and forests surrounding Smolensk hold memory in subtle, enduring ways, threading continuity through land and sky. Streams mirror light across stones and soil, carrying reflection along gentle courses. Trees brush leaves overhead, threading air with soft rhythm and quiet acknowledgement. Paths meander through fields, forests, and hills, threading movement and stillness into a single persistent flow. Villagers observe the landscape quietly, threading awareness, care, and reflection into daily routines. Dust settles over grass, soil, and stones, preserving soft records of passage without urgency. Birds call faintly in hidden branches, threading melody into stillness. Every measured movement carries the weight of memory, threading reflection into the hush that blankets land and city alike. And across all roads, fields, and rivers, Smolensk breathes softly, holding memory, endurance, and quiet presence in a single patient rhythm. The city endures as a threshold, a pause, and a gentle witness to history's slow unfolding. The streets of the city themselves speak in whispers, each stone and building threading memory into movement and stillness. Windows reflect faint light, carrying warmth across quiet lanes and squares. Trees brush leaves in gentle rhythm, their movement threading acknowledgement into every corner. Streams ripple gently through gardens and pathways, threading reflection across water, stone, and soil. Dust settles lightly over paths and roofs, marking passage with quiet persistence. Villagers move through streets with calm attention, threading care and continuity into daily life. Monuments and plaques rise softly, threading stories, memory, and gratitude into spaces where loss once held sway. Birds flit between branches, threading faint notes through the hush of air. Every sound, gesture, and pause threads memory and endurance through the city's pulse. And in this measured rhythm, Smolensk becomes a quiet gateway, threading the past into the present with patience and grace. Fields, forests, and quiet roads beyond the city stretch outward like threads of memory, soft yet persistent. Gentle slopes, hollows, and mossed paths mark spaces shaped by endurance, threading reflection into every step. Streams ripple softly, reflecting muted light, and carrying the gentle rhythm of water across stones. Trees sway above, brushing leaves in whispers that echo patient acknowledgement. Dust rises lightly with wind or movement, threading soft records of passage across earth and stone. Villagers move slowly through distant paths, threading awareness, reflection, and calm continuity into daily life. Birds call faintly across hills and forests, threading melody into stillness and shadow. Every step, pause, and careful gesture threads memory into the land, connecting present awareness with quiet persistence. And as the light softens toward evening, Smolensk holds the hush of history gently, threading absence, resilience, and calm into every corner. The city and its surroundings breathe softly, carrying both story and silence together with enduring grace. At twilight, the city seems to exhale slowly, threads of memory and reflection moving quietly through streets, squares, and forests. Streams ripple gently in fading light, threading water, stone, and reflection into one persistent pulse. Trees brush leaves overhead, echoing the soft rhythm of wind, life, and memory. Dust settles lightly across roads and gardens, preserving gentle traces of passage and reflection. Birds call faintly in distant branches, threading melody through the hush of evening. Villagers move with soft awareness, threading care and continuity into daily acts as night approaches. Monuments, memorials, and open fields hold attention patiently, threading quiet acknowledgement into the landscape. Every gesture, step, and observation carries memory forward, threading past and present into enduring calm. And as darkness folds gently over land and city alike, Smolensk rests quietly, a gateway, a graveyard, and a patient witness to history. In the hush of night, the city whispers softly of endurance, memory, and the quiet turning of time.